In Regency, England, a storm may destroy a cottage, but it is love that truly unsettles the heart. If you'd like early access and ad-free listening, click the Join button to explore the 3-channel membership options. Your support helps bring more Regency romances to life. The Duke and Miss Finch begins now. Chapter 1. Lyndhurst Estate, Sussex, late May, 1816. Christopher Vale, Duke of Lyndhurst, arrived at his estate beneath a sky the colour of polished silver. The carriage wheels rolled steadily along the familiar drive, though nothing else felt familiar to him. It had been nearly 12 years since he had last resided here for more than a fortnight at a time. London had demanded him. Parliament had required him. Society had studied him. Now Lyndhurst required him. He sat opposite the carriage window, his gloved hands resting lightly on the silver head of his walking stick, watching the wide pasture beyond the glass. The estate was prosperous, though not well kept. Hedgerows needed trimming, and a distant fence sagged at one corner. Order, he thought. It shall have order. His late father had governed with genial indulgence. Christopher intended something steadier, more efficient. A well-run estate was not merely profitable, it was a duty to those who depended upon it. The carriage slowed as they approached a meadow bordered by low stone walls. A flicker of movement drew his eye. Boys, 2 of them, and a goat. Christopher leaned slightly forward. At the centre of the small chaos stood a young woman. She did not shout, she did not flail. She simply stood, sleeves rolled neatly to her forearms, directing the disorder with remarkable calm. "Samuel, not toward the road," she called, her voice clear but not sharp. "Oliver, if you value your boots, you will step away from that puddle." The goat bolted left. The smaller of the boys lunged heroically and missed. The young woman moved quickly, catching the red ribbon tied loosely about the animal's neck. The late afternoon sun struck her hair at that precise moment, turning it to warm gold. Christopher stilled. It was not merely that she was beautiful, though she undeniably was. She stood a little taller than most women, her movements quick and assured rather than flustered. Her hair, a warm honey gold in the afternoon light, had been pinned up with practical intent, though several rebellious curls had already escaped near her temples. Her eyes were blue, clear, alert, and far more interested in catching the goat than in the carriage observing her. It was her composure that caught him. She stood as though she belonged exactly where she was. The carriage halted briefly to allow a farm cart to pass. From this nearer vantage, Christopher observed more. The 2 boys were plainly twins, though no one observing them for long would mistake them for identical. Both were about 10, both sandy blonde, both dressed in trousers that had grown a little too short for energetic legs and boots, permanently acquainted with mud. Yet the resemblance ended there. 1. Samuel, as Christopher would soon learn, seemed in constant motion, his sandy hair falling into his eyes as he charged enthusiastically from one disaster to the next, usually with a smudge on his cheek and a triumphant grin. The other, Oliver, stood a half step behind him more often than not. Darker blonde hair kept slightly neater, his sharper gaze watching events unfold with quiet calculation, the sort of boy who appeared less responsible for mischief than suspiciously well-informed about it. Then the young woman glanced toward the carriage. Their eyes met. Recognition flickered in her expression. She had seen his portrait in the village hall often enough, yet she only inclined her head once in polite acknowledgement before returning to the goat. Interesting, Christopher thought. Who resides in that cottage? He asked without turning. His steward, seated opposite, cleared his throat. The Finch family, Your Grace. Respectable tenants. The late Mr. Finch served as local magistrate. Christopher nodded faintly. A magistrate's daughter, then. That explained her composure. The carriage resumed its progress, but the image lingered. Golden hair in sunlight, calm in disorder. He did not like that it lingered. Later that afternoon, Miss Matilda Finch stood at the narrow table in their cottage kitchen, calculating. She pressed the end of a pencil to the margin of a reused scrap of paper and did the sums again in her head before committing them to graphite. Timber, at current rates. Nails. Labour. She subtracted what remained in the household tin. It would not suffice. She inhaled slowly. Her father's voice returned to her, as it often did in moments of arithmetic strain. Gentle, measured. "Never fear numbers, Tilly," he had once said, guiding her small hand across a ledger page. "They are honest companions. They only reveal what is already true." What was true, she thought now, was that the roof required reinforcement before winter. From outside came a crash, followed by Samuel's triumphant declaration, "It survived." "That is rarely reassuring," she murmured. She set the pencil aside and stepped to the doorway. The meadow lay quiet in the waning light. Clouds had begun to gather low along the horizon, their undersides bruised with the promise of rain. Oliver approached her cautiously. "Do you believe storms can sense weak roofs?" "I believe storms are impartial," she replied, "which is far worse." He considered that gravely. She rested a hand briefly on his shoulder. "We shall mend it," she said, more firmly than she felt. "Your father would expect nothing less." Oliver nodded, reassured. Behind her calm expression, her mind continued its quiet tally. If she completed the embroidery commission for Mrs. Talbot before week's end, if she assisted Mr. Carter with his tenancy petition, if she reduced the household sugar allotment, it might be managed. The wind shifted. She looked again toward the darkening sky. Please not tonight, she thought. But the first low roll of thunder answered her. And far across the estate, at Lyndhurst Manor, Christopher Vale paused mid-step near the tall library windows, as the same thunder reached his ears. Storms, he reflected, were inconvenient. He had not yet realized how much this one would change. The storm did not arrive gently. It descended upon Lyndhurst with sudden authority, as though the sky itself had grown impatient. Rain struck the cottage roof in sharp, relentless sheets. Wind pressed against the shutters until the hinges groaned in protest. Inside, Tilly moved with swift efficiency. "Samuel, latch the back window properly," she said, steady but firm. "Oliver, bring the basin from the washstand." Lightning flared, illuminating the small kitchen in stark white. For a moment, everything was suspended. The kettle, the table, the thin seam in the ceiling where she knew the timber had weakened. Then thunder followed, so immediate it seemed to shake the crockery. Her mother pressed a hand to her chest. Mrs. Eleanor Finch possessed the gentle composure of a woman who had spent many years smoothing the worries of others. Those storms still startled her, despite every effort at dignity. "It will pass." From the far side of the table came the decisive snap of a folding fan. Aunt Eugenia, seated upright as though presiding over a drawing room rather than a threatened cottage, regarded the ceiling with theatrical suspicion. Her white hair was arranged in an elaborate structure that had survived the entire storm thus far, though the brooch at her collar, unnecessarily large for any occasion, flashed alarmingly in the lightning. "Roofs," she declared, "are remarkably dependable until the precise moment they are not." Tilly looked at the ceiling. She feared the precise moment might be approaching. A sharp crack sounded overhead. All movement ceased. Water began to drip, first in a hesitant rhythm, then faster. Tilly stepped onto a chair without hesitation and pressed her palm against the ceiling beam. It trembled beneath her touch. Not good, she thought. She calculated instinctively. The weight of the rain, the angle of the pitch, the weakened join near the chimney stack. Another crack, louder. "Outside," she said at once, quickly but calmly. They obeyed. Years of her quiet authority had seen to that. She ushered her mother and aunt through the door, then the twins, who lingered stubbornly, reluctant to abandon the spectacle. She stepped into the rain just as the roof gave way with a splintering collapse. The sound was immense. Wood shattered inward. Tiles broke against the hearthstone. A cloud of dust and damp debris burst into the storm-dark air. For a moment, they all stood in stunned silence. The cottage leaned at an angle that suggested it had surrendered entirely. Samuel exhaled. "That seems unfortunate." Tilly brushed rain from her eyelashes. "Yes," she said calmly, "it does." Aunt Eugenia snapped open her fan. "I should like it recorded that I had reservations about that roof." Tilly's mind had already moved on to practical matters. Salvageable items, Dry clothing, temporary shelter. The Talbots, perhaps. No, their cottage was too small. The Carters had 3 children of their own. She inhaled, forcing steadiness. Her father had once told her that composure was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it rule. She would not allow fear to rule. Gather what you can from the shed, she instructed. We will make arrangements. Rain soaked through her gown, turning pale blue muslin translucent and heavy. Her hair slipped free from its pins, clinging in golden strands along her cheek. She did not notice. Across the meadow, lantern light appeared, steady, approaching. Christopher Vale had not intended to ride out in the storm, but a stable boy had come running to the house to report lanterns and shouting at the Finch cottage. In weather like this, such signs rarely meant anything good. Christopher had not paused to deliberate. Now he reined in his horse at the edge of the cottage yard. The sight before him halted him more effectively than the thunder. The cottage roof had caved inward entirely. Debris lay scattered. The family stood exposed to the rain, and at the centre of them, issuing calm instructions as though managing a minor inconvenience rather than catastrophe, stood Miss Finch. Her gown clung to her frame, her sleeves were soaked. Her golden hair had come loose entirely, falling down her back in rain-darkened waves. She turned at the sound of his horse's approach. For the second time that day, their eyes met. She did not look embarrassed. She did not look helpless. She looked entirely in command. "Your Grace," she called over the storm, inclining her head with composed civility. "I fear we have encountered a structural disagreement with the weather." Christopher dismounted at once. "Is anyone injured?" he asked. "No," she replied. "We evacuated in time." He surveyed the damage quickly, his jaw tightening. "It would require significant repair." "You cannot remain here," he said. "That is evident," she answered, not unkindly. One of the twins stepped forward. "It was very impressive, Your Grace. It collapsed magnificently." Christopher regarded him gravely. "Let us hope the next display of magnificence occurs elsewhere." A faint curve touched Miss Finch's mouth despite herself. "Even now, she is composed," he thought. "Even now." Rain streamed down her face, but her gaze remained steady, proud, assessing him as much as he assessed the ruin. He felt, unexpectedly, that he was the one being measured, and he found that he did not object. Thunder rolled again. He removed his gloves deliberately. "The Dower house stands empty," he said, his voice firm but even. "It is dry, structurally sound. You and your family will remove there at once." Silence followed. The children stared at him. Miss Finch did not speak immediately. Pride flickered across her expression, a subtle tightening at the corners of her eyes. "We cannot impose," she said at last. "You are not imposing," he replied. "You are tenants of this estate. Your safety is my responsibility." She held his gaze. Behind her calm exterior, calculations began again, not of timber and nails this time, but of dignity and necessity. He saw the moment she weighed them, and he waited. Rain softened to a steady curtain, less violent now, but no less insistent. Tilly drew her shawl more tightly about her shoulders, though it offered little warmth. The Dower house, it was not a small offer. It was not a casual kindness, to enter a duke's property not as servants, nor as guests of rank, but as displaced tenants. That was a delicate matter. Her father had always been careful about dignity. "Accept help," he had once told her quietly, when a neighbouring farmer had insisted upon sending over coal during a harsh winter, "but never surrender your independence in the accepting of it." She looked at Christopher Vale, and wondered what accepting this would cost. "My brothers are not gentle," she said at last, "nor is my aunt restrained. The goat is opinionated." Behind her, Aunt Eugenia lifted her chin as if to confirm this was accurate. Christopher's mouth shifted almost imperceptibly. "The Dower house has survived 3 dowager duchesses," he said. "I believe it equal to your brothers." Samuel beamed at this. Oliver narrowed his eyes thoughtfully, as if already calculating how to test that assertion. Tilly did not smile. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "we are grateful for your concern. However, we have managed thus far." "Managing," he replied evenly, glancing toward the fractured roof, "is no longer sufficient." His tone was not unkind. It was steady, certain. He stepped closer, though still at a respectful distance. "The storm will return before morning," he continued. "The ground is already unstable. You have children and your mother to consider." He did not add that she herself should be considered. She noticed the omission. Her pride flared briefly, then settled. She could refuse. She could attempt to crowd her family into a neighbour's already narrow cottage. She could insist upon salvaging what little remained and pretend that willpower alone would hold back further weather. Or she could choose sense. She exhaled slowly. "This arrangement," she said, meeting his eyes directly, "will be temporary." "Yes," he replied at once. She studied him. Rain had darkened his hair, one strand fallen slightly from its disciplined arrangement. His coat bore the faint scent of leather and clean starch. His expression remained composed, but there was something else beneath it. Not impatience, not condescension. Responsibility. "You have my word," he added. Something in the way he said it, unadorned, without flourish, settled her final resistance. "Very well," she said. Behind her, the twins erupted in whispers of triumph. Mrs. Finch pressed a hand to her daughter's arm. "Matilda." "It is sensible," Tilly said gently to her mother, and father always valued sense. At the mention of him, her resolve steadied further. Christopher dipped his head once, as though sealing an agreement between equals. "I will send men at first light to secure what can be salvaged," he said. "Tonight, my carriage will convey you." "That is unnecessary," she began. "It is," he said quietly, "already ordered." She almost objected again. Almost. Instead, she nodded. The wind shifted, lifting the loose strands of her golden hair. In the lantern light, she seemed to shine against the darkness. Christopher became aware that he was looking at her too intently. He redirected his attention at once. "Gather only what you require," he instructed. "Nothing that risks another collapse. The Dower house is furnished." Samuel raised his hand. "Does it contain swords?" Christopher paused. "It contains chairs." Oliver considered this. "Chairs may be repurposed." Tilly pressed her lips together, suppressing laughter. Christopher felt, unexpectedly, the faintest inclination to smile. This was not how he had envisioned his first evening at Lyndhurst. He had imagined ledgers, plans, order restored through careful oversight. Instead, he found himself arranging emergency transport for a golden-haired tenant and her formidable household. As he turned to give instructions to the stable boy, he glanced back once more. She stood in the rain, directing her family with calm assurance, her profile outlined by lantern light. Not frantic, not weeping, simply steady. He felt something shift within him, subtle but undeniable. Not attraction alone, recognition. Christopher stood a little apart from the activity, speaking quietly with his steward while the trunks were carried toward the carriage. Tilly found herself studying him in the lantern light. He was taller than she had first realized, noticeably so, even among the men moving about the yard. His shoulders were broad, his posture straight with the unconscious precision of someone long accustomed to command. Dark hair, nearly black in the rain, stirred slightly in the wind and fell once across his forehead before he brushed it back with an absent motion. His face was striking rather than conventionally handsome. A strong jaw, a straight nose, cheekbones sharply defined in the shifting light. When he turned briefly toward the lantern, she saw that his eyes were grey, observant, cool at first glance. Yet when he spoke to the stable boy beside him, something in his expression softened unexpectedly. This, she realized, was the Duke of Lyndhurst, and he had come out into the storm. She had expected him to be distant, severe, unapproachable. Instead, he had come himself. That, she thought, changed matters. The rain fell more softly now, steady and clean against the dark fields. Neither of them yet understood that the storm had altered more than the roof. Chapter 2. Invasion of the Dower house. By morning, Lyndhurst no longer felt entirely like Lyndhurst. Christopher Vale stood at the library window, observing what could only be described as an organised migration advancing across his lower drive. 2 trunks of modest size were being carried by a pair of long-suffering, stable hands. Behind them followed another man with a rolled mattress tied carefully with twine. Behind these came the Finch family. Mrs. Finch walked alongside the servants, carrying a small basket over one arm and a teapot in her hands, the latter held with the determined care of someone intent that certain civilities should survive even the collapse of a roof. Samuel followed with a wooden walking stick and a hat box of considerable grandeur tucked under his arm, as though the object had been entrusted to him by fate rather than assigned by reason. The procession possessed the unmistakable air of permanence. Miss Matilda Finch walked at the centre of it, her golden hair neatly secured once more, though a few rebellious curls escaped at her temples. She wore a pale sage morning gown, freshly pressed despite circumstances. The colour softened her brightness without diminishing it. Christopher admired that composure more than he intended. The entire procession, he noticed, seemed to move according to her calm direction. The twins marched ahead like an advance guard. "Oliver," she called gently, "we are relocating, not conquering territory." "That remains to be determined," Oliver replied. Samuel had already begun testing his walking stick against the fence posts with considerable enthusiasm. Aunt Eugenia followed in trailing dignity, clutching a velvet-wrapped bundle and making what appeared to be an announcement of great importance to no one in particular. Although Christopher could not hear the speech from the library window, he felt reasonably confident the bundle was being introduced. He descended the front steps, just as they reached the smaller lane leading toward the Dower house. He had chosen not to meet them directly at the cottage again. Too much familiarity too quickly would invite speculation among servants. Dignity, he reminded himself. Structure. "Your Grace," Miss Finch said, inclining her head. "Miss Finch." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke further, as though both were aware that the circumstances of their acquaintance had altered rather more quickly than etiquette usually allowed. "We appreciate your assistance," she said. "My family will endeavour to cause minimal disruption." Behind her came a clatter followed by a splash as Samuel dropped the walking stick into the ornamental pond. Christopher did not look toward the pond. Some developments were best ignored, particularly those already submerged. "I am confident," he said calmly, "that we shall all survive the transition." The Dower house stood a short distance from the main manor, whitewashed stones softened by climbing roses. As the small procession approached, it became immediately apparent that the household staff had not been idle. The front door stood wide open. Several windows had been thrown up to admit fresh air. Inside the entry hall, 2 maids were vigorously shaking dustcloths, while a footman attempted, with mixed success, to maneuver a rolled carpet through the narrow passage. The air carried the unmistakable scent of soap, lavender polish, and freshly disturbed dust. Christopher reached the door just as the stable hands set down the trunks. "The house has only just been opened," he said. "It should be comfortable by evening." Miss Finch stepped inside and paused, taking in the brisk activity with calm composure. "It already appears far preferable to our previous accommodations," she said. One of the maids curtsied hastily, clutching her dustcloth. "We shall have everything ready directly, miss." "I have no doubt of it," Miss Finch replied kindly. Samuel peered past her shoulder into the hall. "Do you believe the staircase has been tested yet?" "Samuel," she said gently, without turning. "We shall endeavour to preserve the staircase." Oliver examined the carpet currently obstructing the passage. "If one adjusted the angle," Oliver suggested thoughtfully, "the carpet might slide itself the rest of the way." The footman paused, as though uncertain whether this was helpful advice or an impending experiment. Christopher suspected it was both. Mrs. Finch entered next, still holding the teapot with careful dignity. "Oh dear," she murmured softly. "We have arrived in the middle of everything." Christopher inclined his head slightly. "The timing is unfortunate," he said, "but manageable." Aunt Eugenia followed last, pausing dramatically in the doorway. Her gaze swept across the open windows, the bustling servants, and the displaced carpet. "Well," she declared, "it is smaller than Versailles." She stepped inside with measured deliberation. "But adequate." Christopher allowed himself a single breath before replying. "I shall endeavour to recover from the comparison," he said gravely. For the briefest moment, Miss Finch laughed. Christopher suspected he would not forget the sound. The first hour passed in brisk and orderly confusion. Windows were opened throughout the house. Dust sheets disappeared from chairs and tables. A maid hurried past with an armful of freshly aired linens, while another attempted to rescue the displaced carpet from the hallway. Miss Finch moved through the activity with quiet efficiency, directing the placement of trunks and thanking the servants with such calm assurance that the work seemed to proceed more smoothly in her presence. Mrs. Finch established herself immediately near the kitchen hearth, where the rescued teapot was soon filled with freshly brewed tea. Aunt Eugenia selected a high-backed chair in the sitting room and observed the proceedings with the air of a general reluctantly supervising a campaign. The twins explored with energetic curiosity until Miss Finch's voice, calm but unmistakably firm, redirected them whenever their investigations approached structural experimentation. Christopher remained only long enough to confirm that the house would soon be comfortable. From the doorway he watched Miss Finch speaking with the housemaid about linens, her expression thoughtful but composed. Satisfied that the household had settled comfortably, he returned to the manor. By midday, the Dower house no longer resembled a quiet annex of the estate. It breathed. A kettle sang upon the hearth. Trunks lay open with garments neatly folded atop chairs. The scent of soap and starch mingled with lavender polish. In the sitting room, trunks stood open across the floor, their contents gradually surrendering to order. Mrs. Finch knelt beside one of them, carefully lifting folded linens as though reassuring herself that the household, though temporarily displaced, remained intact. Nearby, Aunt Eugenia supervised the proceedings with intense interest. One hand lifted in mild alarm as another drawer was opened. "I trust those are not the Brussels pieces," she said. From the staircase came a burst of laughter as Samuel and Oliver sat on the steps and bumped down them in rapid succession. "Gentlemen," Mrs. Finch called with gentle distress, "your sister did request that the staircase remain standing." The staircase, one imagined, had not been consulted. Later that day, Christopher sat in the library reviewing several estate ledgers which the steward had left for his inspection. Earlier, he had sent word to the Dower house, asking if Miss Finch might call at the manor to review several tenant petitions, knowing she often assisted the villagers with such matters. Sunlight fell across the desk in long, pale rectangles. A knock sounded at the door. "Miss Finch, Your Grace," the footman announced. Christopher looked up. Miss Finch stepped into the room with her usual composed attentiveness, a few loose curls escaping the knot at the nape of her neck. "You wish to speak about the tenant petitions," she said. "Yes," Christopher replied. Her gaze moved across the desk. Several ledgers lay open. "You have been working on the estate accounts?" she asked. "Yes." He regarded her for a moment. "Are you familiar with such matters, Miss Finch?" "Yes," she said. "My father taught me." She stepped closer to the desk and leaned slightly over the ledgers, examining the columns of figures. Silence settled in the room. She placed one hand lightly upon the top ledger. "The barley yields recorded for the South Field," she said, "have been miscalculated." Christopher frowned slightly. "I copied those figures from the steward's report this morning." She glanced down the column again. "The acreage is correct," she said, "but the total assumes the larger field." He leaned closer. She indicated the line with her finger. "The steward recorded the harvest properly, but when the figures were totaled, the calculation used the acreage of the North Field instead." Christopher studied the numbers. She was right. Christopher felt the faint, unmistakable satisfaction of encountering competence. "You are certain?" he asked. "Yes," she said gently. "My father required accuracy in all official documents. He believed figures reflected integrity." There it was. The quiet thread of her upbringing woven into the present. Christopher glanced at her. "You assisted him?" "Frequently," she replied. "Petitions, land disputes, rental agreements. I copied documents, balanced records." She spoke without pride, only fact. "And you now assist tenants with similar matters," he said. Yes. Her gaze remained steady. Not merely beautiful, he thought. Formidable. Christopher closed the ledger thoughtfully. My steward departed for Bath this morning, he said. His brother has taken ill. Until his return, the accounts require rather more attention than I anticipated. I do not require charity, she said quietly then. If we are to reside here, even temporarily, I will earn it. You believe residence here is a transaction? He asked. I believe, she replied, that dignity is preserved through contribution. He studied her for a long moment. You may review the accounts, he said at last. Her brows lifted. Formally? As a state assistant, he clarified, for the present. Something warm flickered in her eyes. That is acceptable, she said. Christopher suspected Miss Finch might prove unusually useful. For a long moment they stood side by side at the desk, shoulders nearly aligned. Not touching. Christopher became aware, perhaps too aware, of the quiet steadiness of her presence beside him. You have an eye for detail, he said quietly. My father believed neglect is rarely intentional, she replied. It is simply unattended detail. And you believe Lyndhurst has been neglected? I believe, she said carefully, that it has been waiting. The words lingered between them. Sunlight shifted slowly across the desk. Outside, the estate moved steadily through its day. And in the quiet of the library, something steadier than chaos had begun to form. Not yet affection, but respect. And respect, Christopher knew, was far more dangerous. Chapter 3. Lantern Light. The invitation was delivered formally. Christopher did not send a casual message across the lawn. Instead, he instructed the butler to carry a written card to the Dower house that afternoon, engraved with the Lyndhurst crest and penned in his own measured hand. Mrs. Finch read it carefully before passing it to her daughter. He invites us all? She asked. Faint surprise softening her voice. Yes, Tilly replied. It was a thoughtful gesture and a strategic one. Servants observed everything. Whispers, once formed, required direction. A public dinner at the manor would establish order where speculation might otherwise grow. Still, as late afternoon light filtered through the Dower house windows, Tilly felt something unfamiliar beneath her usual composure. Not apprehension. Awareness. She stood before the narrow looking glass in her chamber and fastened the final hook at her wrist. The gown she chose was her finest. Pale primrose muslin, light as breath, the fabric falling softly from a high waist. Delicate white embroidery traced the cuffs and neckline, tiny blossoms stitched with patient care the previous spring. The colour warmed her complexion and brightened her blue eyes. Her golden hair was arranged with more attention than usual, parted softly and gathered into a smooth knot, though a few soft curls framed her temples. She fastened the small pearl drops her father had given her. Nothing more. Downstairs, the twins had been washed into reluctant respectability. Their hair, though resisting discipline, had been coaxed into some order. They wore their least worn coats and stood with exaggerated stiffness near the hearth. Aunt Eugenia surveyed Tilly as she descended. Primrose, her aunt declared, adjusting the lace at her own collar. Optimism in fabric form. Sensible. Mrs. Finch stepped forward and smoothed an imaginary crease at her daughter's sleeve. Remember, she said gently, you attend as yourself. I have no intention of being anyone else, Tilly replied softly. Outside, Lyndhurst Manor shone against the darkening sky. Tall windows glowed amber with candlelight, reflecting across the gravel drive like a promise of warmth. Christopher stood near the hearth in the drawing room as the Finch family was announced. He wore a deep midnight blue evening coat, impeccably tailored, the cut precise across his broad shoulders. An ivory waistcoat lay beneath, his cravat tied with disciplined elegance. The faintest silver thread traced the edge of his cuffs, understated but deliberate. He had dressed with more care than usual. He told himself it was propriety. In the entrance hall below, the butler had just opened the great front door. Samuel stopped abruptly upon crossing the threshold. "Oliver," he whispered. Oliver followed his brother's gaze. At the foot of the staircase stood a full suit of armour, polished to a dull silver sheen beneath the lantern light. The visor was lowered, its expression permanently severe. Samuel approached it slowly, circling with deep consideration. "Do you suppose it is guarding something?" he asked. Oliver examined the gauntlet. "More likely it is guarding nothing," he replied, "which is how guards are usually employed." Samuel reached out and tapped the breastplate. The armour responded with a hollow metallic clang that echoed faintly through the hall. Tilly's voice arrived immediately behind them. "Samuel," his hand froze. "Yes, Tilly." "We do not test the defences of the house before dinner." "Of course not," Samuel said, withdrawing his hand with dignity. The butler, who had witnessed the exchange without visible reaction, inclined his head. "If the family will follow me, His Grace awaits in the drawing-room." Moments later, the Finch family entered. Christopher looked up. Samuel and Oliver paused just inside the doorway, their curiosity only partially restrained. Aunt Eugenia inclined her head as though acknowledging an establishment that had nearly met expectations. Mrs. Finch curtsied with quiet dignity. And then Miss Matilda Finch stepped forward. For a moment, Christopher forgot the rest of the room. The primrose muslin seemed to gather and soften the candlelight around her. The embroidery at her wrists drew the eye to her hands, steady, capable hands he had seen guiding children through storm and annotating estate ledgers with clarity. She did not appear overwhelmed. She appeared luminous. "You honour my house," he said. She inclined her head. "We are grateful for the invitation, Your Grace." Conversation followed easily for a short quarter-hour beside the small fire laid against the evening chill. At last the butler appeared quietly in the doorway. "Dinner is served, Your Grace." Christopher offered his arm to Mrs. Finch. "If you please." Together they proceeded toward the dining room. As the family entered, voices in the corridor outside fell briefly silent. Samuel and Oliver paused just inside the threshold, gazing upward at the chandelier in open admiration. Aunt Eugenia inclined her head again, as though acknowledging that the room had met a higher standard than the rest of the house. Christopher gestured toward the long, polished table. "Pray be seated." And as they took their places beneath the candlelight, something subtle shifted once more. This time it was anticipation. Dinner began with quiet ceremony. Footmen moved with unobtrusive precision, placing warmed plates before each guest. Silver caught the candlelight and scattered it softly across crystal glasses. The long mahogany table gleamed like still water beneath the glow. The first course was a delicate white soup, smooth and fragrant with celery root and cream, finished with the faintest touch of nutmeg, steam curled upward in pale ribbons. Samuel regarded his bowl with narrowed eyes. "Be cautious," Samuel murmured to Oliver. "It is suspicious," Oliver said gravely. Tilly lowered her gaze at once, though Christopher saw the unmistakable tremor of amusement at the corner of her mouth. Mrs. Finch tasted first, her movements careful but composed. "It is most excellent, Your Grace," she said. "I am pleased it meets approval," Christopher replied. He watched Tilly lift her spoon. Her manners were natural, not rehearsed. She sat straight but not rigid, her shoulders relaxed, her expression attentive. Yet he noticed something subtle. She ate slowly, measuring each portion with care, not timidly, deliberately. The second course followed, roasted pheasant, its skin crisped to deep amber, carved with quiet expertise. It was served with honeyed carrots glazed in butter until they shone, and tender potatoes scented faintly with rosemary and sea salt. The scent of thyme and warm bread filled the room, rich and comforting. Samuel's eyes widened openly this time. "This bird," he whispered, "and had an excellent ending." Oliver nodded in solemn agreement. Aunt Eugenia accepted her portion with regal satisfaction. "One must respect a decisive ending," she remarked. Christopher turned his attention again to Tilly. She accepted her plate with thanks but declined a second spoonful of carrots when offered. Instead, she ensured her mother's serving was generous before adjusting her own. "You need not be sparing at my table," Christopher said quietly. Her eyes lifted to his. "I am not being sparing," she answered evenly, "only habitual." There was no embarrassment in it, no self-pity, simply truth. He understood then that habit had likely long favoured others over herself. The final course arrived beneath silver lids. Lemon syllabub, pale and airy, almost luminous in shallow crystal dishes. The scent of citrus rose lightly, clean and bright after the richness of the meal. Aunt Eugenia tasted hers and closed her eyes. "This," she declared, "approaches continental ambition." Christopher inclined his head. "I shall inform the kitchen they have nearly succeeded." Samuel consumed his portion with enthusiasm bordering on reverence. Oliver examined the texture before committing himself fully. Conversation unfolded with surprising ease. Christopher spoke of improvements planned for the North Fields. Mrs. Finch asked thoughtful questions about tenant welfare. Even Aunt Eugenia offered commentary on drainage, invoking mysterious French canals as precedent. And through it all, Tilly listened. Not merely politely, but intelligently. When she spoke, it was with clarity and insight. "The eastern boundary hedgerows," she said at one point, "create wind tunnels during winter. If reinforced unevenly rather than uniformly, the lambing season might be less severe." Christopher regarded her with renewed interest. "You have observed this?" "Yes," she replied. "During my father's last year, we reviewed similar concerns for a neighbouring farm." He felt again that quiet shift, admiration deepening into something more personal. Not simply for her mind, but for the way she offered it without display. And as the candles burned lower and laughter rose unexpectedly from his own chest, at some comment of Samuel's regarding swordfish and literal swords, Christopher became aware of something undeniable. Lyndhurst felt altered, not diminished, enlivened. Dinner concluded, not with ceremony, but with warmth. The candles had burned low, their light gentler now, softening the edges of polished silver and porcelain. Even the servants moved more quietly, as though reluctant to disturb the ease that had settled over the table. Christopher rose as the meal concluded. "If you will allow," he said, addressing Mrs. Finch, "I shall see you safely returned." "That is most considerate, Your Grace," she replied. Aunt Eugenia accepted a shawl with theatrical gravity. "Night air," she announced, "lacks refinement." The twins required minimal encouragement to depart. They were whispering about whether the chandelier might be counted as a strategic vantage point in times of siege. Christopher offered his arm to Mrs. Finch, and together they stepped out beneath the darkened sky. The air had cooled, washed clean by the previous night's storm. Lanterns had been lit along the path between the manor and the Dower house, casting pools of amber light across the gravel. Tilly followed a step behind, walking beside her aunt and the boys. Halfway across the lawn, Samuel darted ahead to inspect a lantern more closely. "Do not test its durability," Tilly called calmly. "I was only examining it," Samuel said defensively. Christopher found himself smiling faintly. When they reached the Dower house door, Mrs. Finch thanked him once more with quiet sincerity. Aunt Eugenia inclined her head in a gesture that suggested provisional approval of the evening's arrangements. The twins disappeared inside at once. And then it was only Tilly and Christopher standing together in the lantern light at the Dower house door. For a moment, neither spoke. The night hummed softly with distant crickets. A faint breeze stirred the edges of her primrose sleeves. In the warm glow, the delicate embroidery at her cuffs seemed almost luminous. "You managed the boys well," he said at last. "They are easily managed," she replied, "provided one does not attempt to command them loudly." He considered that. "You believe command requires restraint?" he asked. "I believe respect does," she said. Silence returned, not awkward, but charged with awareness. He became acutely conscious of her nearness. A faint trace of lavender drifted from her shawl. A curl had slipped loose again, brushing softly against her cheek. "You were at ease this evening," he said. "So were you," she answered gently. That surprised him. "I am seldom accused of ease." "You were laughing," she said. He had been. He studied her face in the lantern light. The golden warmth of her hair had deepened in the night, her eyes reflecting the small flame above them. "You declined the second serving of carrots," he said quietly. Her lips curved faintly. "You noticed. I observe what occurs at my table." She held his gaze a moment longer than propriety required. "It is habit," she said again, softer now. "When one manages a household, one learns to take what is sufficient." "And tonight?" he asked. "Tonight," she replied, "was more than sufficient." The words lingered between them. A shift, subtle, undeniable. He reached out. Not fully, not boldly, but enough that his hand hovered near hers, where it rested at her side. He could feel the warmth of her through the thin muslin. She did not step away. For a single suspended heartbeat, the space between their fingers seemed charged with possibility. If he moved even an inch closer, he did not. Instead, he drew his hand back, folding it behind him with practiced restraint. "Good evening, Miss Finch," he said. Her breath had caught, only slightly. "Good evening, Your Grace." She turned and stepped inside, the door closing softly behind her. Christopher remained beneath the lantern a moment longer. The estate was orderly, the tenants were sheltered, the accounts were improving, everything was proceeding precisely as it should. And yet, as he walked back toward the manor beneath the dark, steady sky, he was aware that something within his carefully ordered world had shifted, not dramatically, but irrevocably. Chapter 4. Lessons in Fencing. The idea was, in retrospect, inevitable. Christopher Vale had spent 3 mornings attempting to review estate reports in the small study adjoining the south lawn. For 3 mornings, he had been interrupted by what could only be described as strategic warfare conducted with sticks. Samuel favoured direct assault, Oliver preferred ambush. The 3rd morning concluded when a wooden branch struck the study window with impressive force. Christopher did not sigh, he did not frown, he simply rose. When he stepped outside, the twins froze mid-charge. "Your Grace," Samuel said breathlessly, holding what was unmistakably a broken rake handle. "We are conducting drills." "With agricultural equipment," Christopher observed. "It improves unpredictability," Oliver added. Christopher regarded them for a long moment. Behind them, Miss Finch stood near the rose arbour, with a basket of freshly washed linens at her feet. Several pieces had been spread carefully along the hedge to dry in the sun. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, golden hair loosely gathered at the nape of her neck as she folded the first of the dry cloths with steady concentration. "I apologise," she called. "They have discovered velocity." "I gathered as much," he replied. He turned back to the boys. "Wood is imprecise," he said calmly. "If one intends to duel, one ought to do so properly." Samuel blinked. "Properly?" Oliver's eyes sharpened. "You have swords." "I do," Christopher answered. There was a beat of stunned silence. Tilly looked up quickly. "Your Grace." "They will not touch a blade without instruction," he said evenly. "But if they must expend energy, it may as well be directed." Samuel nearly vibrated with triumph. Oliver attempted composure and failed. An hour later, the south lawn had been cleared. Christopher stood in shirt sleeves, waistcoat discarded, fencing jacket loosely fastened. The twins faced him with wooden practice foils borrowed from the old training room, relics of Christopher's own youth. "Feet apart," he instructed. "Balance first, heroics later." Samuel nodded seriously, then lunged immediately. Christopher sidestepped with minimal effort. Oliver attempted to circle him. "Flank maneuver," he whispered. Beneath a broad elm tree, Tilly continued folding the dry linen she had gathered from the hedge. The basket beside her slowly filled again. From her place in the shade she had a clear view of the lawn. She had never seen the Duke without his coat. The sun caught in his dark hair. His sleeves were rolled neatly, revealing strong forearms shaped by discipline rather than vanity. His posture shifted, less formal now, more fluid, When Samuel lunged again, Christopher parried gently and tapped the boy's shoulder. "Defeated," he said. Samuel frowned. "That seems unlikely." On the contrary. Oliver attacked with surprising accuracy. Christopher blocked, pivoted, and tapped him as well. Also defeated. Oliver lowered his foil slowly. "This is humbling." "It is educational," Christopher corrected. Tilly laughed. Not a polite sound, not restrained. It rang clear across the lawn, warm and bright as sunlight. Christopher glanced toward her before he could stop himself. She was leaning back slightly against the tree, a folded linen cloth forgotten in her hands, her golden hair catching the light as she watched with open amusement. For a moment he forgot entirely that he was meant to be instructing. Samuel seized the opportunity and charged. Christopher barely avoided a blow to the ribs. "That," he said dryly, regaining stance, "is what occurs when one is distracted." Tilly pressed her lips together, though laughter still brightened her eyes. And something unexpected happened. Christopher laughed too. Not a restrained exhale. A real laugh. Low, unguarded, surprised even to his own ears. The twins froze in astonishment. "You make that sound?" Samuel asked. "Occasionally," Christopher replied. And in that moment, the south lawn felt less like an estate and more like a home. What began as instruction rapidly evolved into spectacle. Christopher had intended discipline. What he received was innovation. "Again," he instructed, adopting proper stance. "Observe my footwork." Samuel observed nothing. He charged with the enthusiasm of a cavalry unit that had misplaced its commander. Christopher parried, pivoted, and tapped the boy lightly between the shoulders. Defeated. Oliver narrowed his eyes thoughtfully. "Charging directly rarely works." "That is because you announce it," Christopher replied. Oliver nodded, as if this confirmed a private theory. From beneath the elm tree, Tilly called, "Oliver, do not attempt stealth. It has never succeeded." "Not yet," Oliver corrected. Aunt Eugenia had emerged onto the lawn, shawl draped dramatically despite the warmth. She surveyed the scene with critical attention. "In France," she announced, "duels were conducted with greater elegance." "In France," Christopher replied without turning, "one imagines they were also conducted less near the vegetable garden." Samuel lunged again. Christopher blocked easily this time, guiding the wooden foil aside. "You anticipate poorly," Christopher said. "Do not attack where your opponent expects you." Samuel frowned. "How do I know what he expects?" Christopher hesitated. "That," he said at last, "is the art." Oliver seized the moment and attempted a daring maneuver that involved rolling across the grass. He did not rise as intended. Tilly stood immediately. "Are you injured?" Oliver blinked at the sky. "Not badly injured." Christopher extended a hand and pulled him upright. "You are thinking too far ahead," he said. "Master the present exchange first." Oliver considered this gravely. "You are correct." Samuel raised his foil eagerly. "May we duel each other?" Christopher paused. This was, objectively, unwise. "Yes," he said. Tilly covered her face briefly with one hand. The twins squared off with exaggerated solemnity. "Prepare," Oliver said. "I am always prepared," Samuel answered. They clashed with great enthusiasm and very little coordination. Christopher stepped between them before either could suffer more than wounded pride. "Control," he said firmly. "Balance. Watch." He demonstrated a simple exchange. Advance, parry, disengage. The movement smooth and economical, even without full exertion. There was something compelling in the way he carried himself. Tilly found she had forgotten entirely about the basket of folded linen beside her. "He is different here," she thought, less distant. When he turned toward her again and caught her watching, something in his expression shifted. Not guarded, but aware. "You find this amusing?" he said. "I find it educational," she replied lightly. His eyes held hers a moment longer than necessary. Then Samuel shouted, "I believe I have improved," and lunged directly into Christopher's midsection. Christopher staggered back a single step, more from surprise than impact, and the twins froze. Tilly gasped. For one suspended second, silence fell across the lawn. Then Christopher straightened. "Effective," he said calmly, but lacking finesse. Samuel exhaled in relief, and Tilly laughed again. This time, Christopher did not resist it. He laughed with her, openly. It had been some time since laughter had risen without calculation. The afternoon sun lay warm across the south lawn. The twins resumed their excited whispering over strategy, while Aunt Eugenia offered unsolicited commentary from the garden path. Somewhere beyond the hedges, a cart rattled faintly along the distant lane. For a brief moment, the world felt unexpectedly settled. Then the sound of carriage wheels broke the calm. Christopher noticed it first, not because it was unusual, visitors were hardly rare, but because it intruded upon the easy rhythm that had settled across the lawn. A polished, dark carriage appeared along the upper drive, its crest catching the light as it approached the manor. Tilly followed Christopher's gaze. "Are we under siege?" Samuel asked hopefully. "Regrettably not," Christopher replied. The carriage rolled to a smooth halt near the manor steps. A gentleman descended with easy grace. He was impeccably dressed in a dove-grey riding coat fitted to advantage, buff breeches, and polished boots. His chestnut hair was styled with fashionable care, his expression carrying the relaxed confidence of a man accustomed to being welcomed. Christopher felt something tighten faintly in his chest. "Vale," the gentleman called warmly. "I had word you were in residence at last." Christopher's tone shifted, not cold but contained. "Harcourt." Mr. Edwin Harcourt approached across the lawn with practiced ease, removing his gloves as he came. "I hope I do not intrude," Harcourt said pleasantly. "I was passing through the county and could not resist calling." "You are received," Christopher answered. Harcourt's gaze drifted across the lawn and then settled on Tilly. He paused very slightly. Well-bred men did not stare. Harcourt did not stare, but he looked, and he smiled. Christopher noticed at once. The sensation that followed was unfamiliar and entirely unwelcome. "Have I interrupted a military engagement?" Harcourt asked lightly, observing the foils. "A campaign of limited competence," Christopher replied. Samuel stepped forward immediately. "We are training, under expert supervision," Oliver added. Harcourt laughed easily. "Then I shall endeavour not to interfere with such distinguished proceedings." His eyes returned to Tilly. "And may I inquire," he said smoothly, "who commands the field?" Tilly rose from beneath the elm tree and set aside the basket of folded linen. She curtsied politely. "Miss Matilda Finch," Christopher said, perhaps more briskly than necessary. "Daughter of the late Magistrate Finch." "A pleasure," Harcourt replied, inclining his head. "Your father was well respected." "He was," Tilly answered. Christopher watched the exchange with growing and entirely unreasonable dissatisfaction. There was nothing improper in Harcourt's manner. Nothing excessive. He was charming in the way men are charming when they have practiced it. He asked after Mrs. Finch's comfort. He complimented the twins' evident valour. He admired the southern lawns. And yet, Christopher found himself observing details he did not wish to observe. The way Harcourt angled his body toward Tilly when she spoke, the attentiveness in his expression, the ease. "You reside nearby, Miss Finch?" Harcourt asked. "Temporarily in the Dower house," she replied. "Our cottage roof suffered rather badly in the storm." "How fortunate," Harcourt said smoothly, "that Lyndhurst is under such capable stewardship." The compliment was directed at Christopher. The glance was not. Christopher felt an entirely new and unwelcome sensation, irritation. Entirely unjustified, and therefore particularly inconvenient. He adjusted his cuffs. "Harcourt fences tolerably," Christopher said evenly. "Perhaps you might demonstrate for the boys." Harcourt laughed. "I would not deprive them of superior instruction." But he accepted a foil. The exchange that followed was brief and polished. Harcourt was competent. Christopher was better. Within moments, Christopher disarmed him neatly. Samuel leaned toward Oliver and whispered loudly, "He still wins." Oliver nodded solemnly. That is reassuring. Tilly pressed her lips together, though laughter still brightened her eyes. Christopher's gaze found hers. For a moment the rest of the lawn, the carriage, the guest, the boys, seemed peripheral. Then Harcourt removed his gloves once more. "I hope you will all attend the small gathering at Ashcombe House next week," he said easily. "The county must celebrate Lyndhurst's return to activity." Christopher did not hesitate. "We shall consider it." Tilly inclined her head politely. "We would be honoured." Christopher disliked how naturally she said it. He disliked that Harcourt smiled in response. He disliked most of all that he could not justify the feeling at all. As Harcourt took his leave, the carriage wheels fading once more into the distance, the lawn seemed quieter than before. Samuel broke the silence. "Is he an enemy?" "No," Christopher said. Oliver considered this. Should he be? Christopher's gaze drifted unbidden toward Tilly. "I sincerely hope not," he replied. But the warmth of the afternoon had shifted, and the Duke of Lyndhurst realized that laughter was not the only thing capable of unsettling him. Chapter 5. Whispers in the County. Rumours did not arrive at Lyndhurst by carriage. They arrived on foot. They travelled in baskets and beneath bonnets, in lowered voices at the bakery, in the pause that lingered just half a breath too long when the Duke's name was mentioned. A tenant family installed at the Dower house, a golden-haired daughter, frequent consultations in the Duke's study. It was nothing scandalous. It was precisely enough. Christopher became aware of it, not through accusation, but through courtesy. The vicar's wife began addressing Miss Finch with conspicuous politeness. The grocer inquired after the Dower house with unusual interest. Even the butler cleared his throat more often than usual when Miss Finch's name appeared in estate matters. Christopher ignored it. Until the letter arrived. It bore his mother's elegant script. Firm, assured, unmistakably aristocratic. He broke the seal in the quiet of his study. "My dear Christopher, it pleases me to hear that Lyndhurst has regained activity under your guidance. However, I am informed, through entirely reliable channels, that your household now includes a young lady of uncommon beauty. Beauty, as you well know, is not qualification. I urge you, with maternal sincerity, to consider returning to London for the season. Several advantageous alliances remain possible. Your position requires careful choice. Affection is agreeable. Prudence is essential. Your devoted mother." Christopher folded the letter slowly. He did not resent her caution. It was practical. Expected. Yet something in him resisted the implication. That his present considerations were sentimental. That Miss Finch, intelligent, composed, quietly formidable Miss Finch, might be reduced to rumour. He rose and crossed to the window. On the lawn below, he saw her walking beside her mother, their heads bent together in discussion. The twins followed some distance behind, engaged in a debate that involved vigorous hand gestures and several unmistakable fencing motions. She moved with calm purpose, sunlight catching faintly in her hair. Not an alliance, not a calculation, a presence. He did not care for the way London intruded upon the view. 3 days later, the invitation to Ashcombe House could no longer be declined. "It is small," Tilly assured her mother, "only a musical evening." Aunt Eugenia adjusted her brooch. "All evenings are musical," she said, "if one listens critically." Christopher had sent a parcel earlier that afternoon. It was delivered without explanation. Inside lay a dress of pale blue silk, refined rather than showy, the colour of the sky at that brief hushed moment before dawn fully breaks. Even before she unfolded it, the fabric declared itself. Not the flat cheer of cotton, but silk with a quiet lustre that caught the light and then let it go. Beneath the gown rested a note in his steady hand. For services rendered in the improvement of Lyndhurst accounts. Payment is overdue. Lyndhurst, Tilly lifted the silk carefully between her fingers. It slid over her skin, cool and almost weightless, yet with that faint, crisp whisper fine silk makes when it moves. It was beautiful. Not charity. Compensation. She understood the distinction. The cut was plain in the current mode. Made to fall, not to flare, but the silk transformed it entirely. The bodice rose to a high waist just under the bust, fitted smoothly there and then released into a long, unbroken column. It would skim her figure in disciplined, graceful lines, the sheen of the cloth deepening the clear blue of her eyes whenever she turned. The neckline was modest, a softened oval rather than a daring scoop, finished with fine pleating that gave it texture without ornament. The sleeves were neat and practical, long enough to be proper, close enough to be intentional, ending in narrow cuffs that suggested gloves and good rooms, not work. There was no extravagant trimming, no shout of ribbons or metallic braid, only the quality of the material and the assurance of a garment meant to be worn with composure. A payment, then, precise as his handwriting, and impossible to misunderstand. When she descended the stairs of the Dower house that evening, even Aunt Eugenia paused. "Ah," her aunt said thoughtfully, "now that is a gown designed to be noticed." Mrs. Finch's eyes shone faintly. "You look radiant." Tilly smiled, though her pulse felt less steady than usual. She did not know whether to be grateful or cautious. Perhaps both. The Lyndhurst carriage arrived shortly before dusk. Christopher had sent it for Mrs. Finch and Matilda, ensuring their journey to Ashcombe House required no inconvenience. Christopher himself had ridden ahead. Ashcombe House was not grand in the manner of Lyndhurst, but it possessed elegance of its own. The drawing-room glowed with lamplight reflected in gilt mirrors and polished floors. A quartet had assembled near the pianoforte, their instruments resting lightly against dark coats and silk gowns. The air carried the scent of beeswax, perfume, and warmed pastry. Christopher entered with composed assurance. He was aware, as always, that his presence altered a room. Conversations adjusted, backs straightened, invitations multiplied. Tonight, however, something else altered the air. Miss Matilda Finch. She walked at his side, with measured calm, her blue silk catching the lamplight with quiet radiance. Her golden hair had been arranged more intricately than usual, its warmth striking against the cool tone of her gown. Heads turned, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Christopher felt it before he saw it. The subtle shift in male attention. Mr. Harcourt approached almost immediately. "Miss Finch," he said warmly, bowing. "I believe the evening improves already." "You are generous," she replied. Merely observant. Christopher inclined his head in greeting, but did not smile. "Mrs. Finch," Christopher said, "may I present Mr. Edwin Harcourt, a neighbouring gentleman?" Harcourt bowed. "A pleasure." Others followed. A young baronet, whose name Christopher scarcely recalled, asked if she favoured music. A widowed gentleman complimented the embroidery at her cuffs. Even the vicar's nephew, newly returned from Cambridge and entirely too pleased with himself, attempted a conversation about Milton. Tilly answered them all with calm warmth, never encouraging too much, never lingering too long. But she was noticed. Christopher did not care for the sensation rising within him. It was not anger. Not quite. It was sharper. She belongs at Lyndhurst, he thought, and immediately resented the phrasing. She belongs nowhere but where she chooses. He moved through the room with disciplined courtesy, yet his attention returned repeatedly to the same place. To her. At one point she laughed softly at something Harcourt said. Christopher felt the sound travel through him in a way he did not appreciate. Harcourt leaned slightly closer. Not improperly, merely attentively. Christopher stepped forward without conscious decision. "Miss Finch," he said evenly. "Lord Ashcombe was asking about tenant yields in the North Parish." Tilly blinked. "He was?" "No," Christopher replied calmly, "but he ought to." For a fraction of a second, surprise crossed her face. Then understanding. She inclined her head. Of course, Your Grace. Harcourt smiled faintly, as though recognizing a maneuver when he saw one. Christopher did not care for that either. They moved toward the tall windows at the edge of the room. You are in demand, Christopher said quietly. I was unaware I had become a public commodity, she answered. That was not my meaning. I know, she said gently. Music began, light and lilting, softening conversation into a murmur. You need not intercept every conversation, she added. I was not aware I was doing so. You were. Her tone was not accusatory, merely observant. Christopher exhaled slowly. It appears, he said, that the county has taken an interest in Lyndhurst's newest resident. The county has taken an interest in Lyndhurst, she said. I merely come with it. Silence hovered. And you do not approve? She asked softly. He hesitated. Approval was not the word. I find it distracting, he said. Her lips curved faintly. I did not realize I possessed such power. You do not, he replied too quickly. She arched one brow slightly. For the first time that evening, Christopher felt observed. The music shifted. Couples began to gather along the polished floor. It was not a formal ball, but the suggestion of a dance had been offered and accepted. Mr. Harcourt returned. Miss Finch, he said with a bow, may I claim this set? Tilly glanced instinctively toward Christopher. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but Christopher saw it. You may, she said. Harcourt offered his hand. Christopher did not object. He did not possess the right, and yet, as Harcourt led her into the line of dancers, something within him tightened with unmistakable clarity. She moved gracefully, not with the practiced extravagance of London society, but with natural rhythm and poise. The blue silk caught the candlelight with each turn. Other men noticed. He noticed them noticing. Harcourt leaned close to speak. She answered with polite warmth. Her laughter rose once, light and unguarded, and Christopher felt the sound like a physical sensation. This is absurd, he told himself. She is not yours. The thought struck harder than expected. Across the room, Mrs. Finch sat upright, hands folded, her calm expression betraying nothing, though her eyes followed her daughter carefully. Christopher remained near the window, composed. Still, inside, something unfamiliar unfolded. Jealousy. Not loud, not possessive, but unmistakable. When the dance ended, Harcourt retained her hand half a second longer than necessary. Tilly withdrew it gently. She returned to Christopher. You do not dance, she said lightly. I prefer observation. Of agricultural yields, among other matters. She studied him. A faint tension lingered in his jaw. You disapprove, she said quietly. I have not offered disapproval. No, she agreed. You have offered silence. The room hummed with conversation around them. You were admired this evening, he said at last. And that troubles you? He hesitated. The correct answer was no. The honest answer was less convenient. It complicates matters, he said carefully. What matters? He held her gaze. The simplicity of your presence at Lyndhurst. She considered that. My presence was never simple, she said gently. It was merely unnoticed. The truth of it struck him. He realized then that the county's attention was not the source of his discomfort. It was the realization that others now saw what he had begun to see. Intelligence, grace, light, and that they might seek to claim it. The music shifted, and couples began to gather along the polished floor. Christopher glanced toward the dancers before looking back at her. Will you dance, Miss Finch? He asked. She placed her hand lightly in his. Yes, Your Grace. He was precise, controlled, every step exact. She matched him easily, her gaze meeting his at each turn. I believe the gown originated at Lyndhurst, she said quietly. It did. Then, I am grateful. You have been of considerable help at Lyndhurst, he said. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly during the next exchange. For one suspended moment the world narrowed to candlelight and breath and silk. He understood then fully that this was no longer simple admiration, and that made the whispers in the county far more dangerous than he had first believed. When the dance ended, applause rose lightly around the room. Christopher released her hand, slowly. Christopher Vale, Duke of Lyndhurst, was no longer entirely certain he governed everything that occurred within his own walls. Chapter 6. The Offer. The morning after Ashcombe House dawned deceptively bright. Sunlight spilled across Lyndhurst lawns as though nothing delicate had shifted beneath the surface of the previous evening. Christopher had risen early. He had reviewed correspondence. He had begun a letter twice and abandoned it both times. He had avoided looking toward the Dower house. He told himself it was discipline. He did not examine the rest. Across the estate, Tilly walked alone along the southern path, her gloved hands clasped lightly before her. She had chosen a simple walking gown of soft cream muslin, unadorned but well fitted, her bonnet tied securely against the breeze. She needed air. Attention had followed her home from Ashcombe House. Not loudly, but persistently. Mrs. Finch had said nothing, yet Tilly knew her mother understood what admiration could mean. Security, opportunity, relief. She had not allowed herself to dwell upon it until footsteps approached behind her. Miss Finch. She turned. Mr. Edwin Harcourt removed his hat with easy courtesy. "I hope I do not intrude," he said. "You do not," she replied, though her pulse quickened faintly. They walked slowly along the gravel path bordered by low hedges. "I shall not pretend subtlety," Harcourt began after a moment. "I admire you greatly." Tilly did not look away. "I am honoured," she said carefully. "You possess grace," he continued. "Intelligence, composure, qualities not always found in equal measure." He paused, then spoke more deliberately. "I also understand your family's circumstances." There it was. Not insult. Fact. "My estate," he continued, "is modest but stable. My mother resides comfortably. I have no sisters to complicate domestic arrangements." Tilly's breath slowed. "I would be proud," he said quietly, "to offer you my name and the security that accompanies it." Silence settled between them. Birdsong carried faintly from the trees. Security. For her mother. For the twins. For Aunt Eugenia and her continental ambitions. It was not romance he offered. It was stability. A future without uncertainty. "You are generous," she said at last. "I am practical," he corrected gently. "Affection may grow where respect is present." She did not recoil from the logic. She did not embrace it either. "I would require time," she said. "Of course." He watched her carefully. "I do not seek to hurry you," he added, "but I would value your consideration." She gave a small nod. "You have it." Unbeknownst to them, Christopher had turned onto the adjacent path moments earlier. He had not intended to overhear. He heard enough. "Offer you my name. Security. Your consideration." He stopped walking. From where he stood, partially obscured by hedging, he could see them only in profile. He saw Harcourt's posture, open, assured. He saw Tilly's stillness. He saw her hesitation. He did not hear her uncertainty. He did not hear the absence of warmth in her voice. He heard, "You have it." The words struck with clean finality. Christopher did not step forward. He did not reveal himself. He turned away. Christopher returned to the manor with measured steps. Outwardly, nothing altered. He gave instructions to the estate clerk. He reviewed harvest tallies. He signed correspondence with his usual decisive hand. Inwardly, something had shifted with unnerving clarity. Security. His name. Her consideration. He had no claim upon her. He repeated this as fact. He had offered shelter, employment, respect. He had not offered marriage. He had not offered permanence. And now another man had. Mr. Harcourt took his leave with measured courtesy. "I shall await your answer with patience, Miss Finch." She bowed her head slightly. "Thank you." He replaced his hat and turned back toward the manor path. He had gone scarcely 30 yards when two small figures emerged from behind a hedge. Samuel and Oliver. They stood side by side with suspicious composure. "Good morning, sir," Samuel said. "Good morning," Harcourt replied politely. Oliver stepped forward. "We are conducting experiments." "With what?" Harcourt asked. Samuel pointed. "With trajectory." Harcourt followed the gesture. Nothing happened. For half a second. Then the small bucket balanced precariously above the hedge, tipped forward. A modest but decisive quantity of pond water descended directly onto Mr. Harcourt's boots. The twins stepped back with identical expressions of scientific interest. Silence followed. Harcourt looked down. Water dripped steadily from polished leather. Samuel spoke first. That result exceeded expectation. Oliver nodded gravely. "The angle requires adjustment." Harcourt removed his gloves slowly. His smile did not disappear, but it changed. "Gentlemen," he said, "I suggest your experiments be conducted elsewhere." His tone was perfectly civil, but the warmth had vanished. The twins exchanged a glance. "The Duke only says we must avoid windows," Samuel whispered. Harcourt replaced his gloves. "I am not the Duke of Lyndhurst." With that, he continued down the path. Behind him, Samuel frowned. He did not enjoy the experiment. Oliver considered this thoughtfully. No. Then he brightened, but it was informative. That evening, as was customary, Tilly came to the small study to review the week's adjusted accounts. She paused at the threshold when she saw him. He stood at the desk, coat properly fastened, expression composed, more composed than usual. "Your Grace," she said. "Miss Finch." The distance in his tone was subtle. She felt it immediately. She crossed the room and placed the ledger upon the desk. "The revised figures for tenant repairs," she began, "reflect a reduction in projected winter expense." "I have reviewed them," he said. She blinked faintly. "Oh." Silence followed. He did not step closer to examine the pages beside her, as he had before. He did not ask questions. He did not linger. She felt something tighten beneath her ribs. "You seem preoccupied," she said carefully. "I have much to consider," he replied evenly. The words were neutral. The meaning was not. She hesitated. "May I ask?" "I encountered Mr. Harcourt this morning," he interrupted, his gaze steady but unreadable. Her pulse stumbled. "I see. He is an attentive gentleman." Christopher continued. "Well regarded. Sensible." Each word was precise, measured. "He has made you an offer." It was not a question. She swallowed. "He has," she said quietly. "And you are considering it." The air in the room seemed suddenly thinner. "I said I would," she answered. He gave a small, formal nod. "That is prudent." Prudent. The word landed coldly. She searched his expression for something. Disapproval. Protest. Challenge. There was nothing. Only civility. "You believe it wise?" she asked before she could stop herself. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I believe," he said, "that security is not to be dismissed lightly." She felt the sting of that. Security. As though that were all she sought. As though her heart were an account to be balanced. "You speak as though the matter were merely practical," she said softly. "Is it not?" he replied. Silence fell. He would not meet her vulnerability with vulnerability. He would not step beyond propriety. And she would not beg for what he had not offered. "I value your position at Lyndhurst," he added, voice steady once more. "Should your circumstances change, suitable arrangements will be made." Suitable arrangements would be made. The finality of it struck harder than she expected. He was preparing to lose her. He was preparing to let her go. And he would do so with perfect composure. "I see," she said. He gave a small, formal nod. "You have always conducted yourself with sense, Miss Finch. I trust you will continue to do so." She closed the ledger gently. "Yes, Your Grace." She turned toward the door. He did not stop her. Not this time. The evening air felt cooler than it had the night before. Tilly stepped out of the manor and onto the gravel path, without waiting for escort. She did not trust her voice to withstand further civility. Suitable arrangements would be made. The phrase repeated with quiet cruelty. She had not realized how accustomed she had become to their shared work, to the way he stood beside her at the desk, to the subtle warmth beneath his reserve, to the unguarded laughter on the lawn. She had not realized how much she valued it until it withdrew. Halfway to the Dower house, she slowed. Had she expected protest? A declaration? No. The Duke of Lyndhurst was not a man given to impulsive claims, and she had given him nothing to claim. You have it. She had said the words calmly, practically. She had not meant acceptance. She had meant thought, but he had heard certainty. And now pride stood between them, like a wall. Neither wished to scale first. At the manor, Christopher remained at his desk long after the lamp burned low. He told himself he had acted correctly. He had not interfered. He had not presumed. He had not burdened her with sentiment she might not return. He had preserved her dignity. So why did the room feel emptied of something vital? He rose abruptly and crossed to the window. The Dower house glowed faintly in the distance, a small rectangle of light in the dark. He imagined her inside, seated beside her mother, speaking calmly of practical futures. He imagined Harcourt's name spoken with quiet acceptance. His hand tightened on the window frame. This is what prudence demands, he told himself. You cannot resent a choice you never invited her to make. He forced himself back to the desk, forced himself to read. But the numbers blurred. Across the lawn, Tilly sat beside her mother at the small hearth. Mrs. Finch watched her quietly. You are troubled, her mother said gently. Tilly tried to compose herself. I am considering an offer from Mr. Harcourt. That is not the only thing troubling you, Mrs. Finch said. Tilly's breath faltered. Mr. Harcourt believes it wise, she said softly. Mrs. Finch's gaze sharpened slightly. And you? Tilly looked into the fire. She saw blue silk in candlelight, a gloved hand extended for a dance, laughter beneath an elm tree, a moment beneath a lantern when neither of them had moved. I do not know, she admitted. Her mother reached for her hand. Security has its place, Mrs. Finch said quietly. But happiness must live in a marriage as well. The word lingered. Happiness. Tilly lowered her gaze. At Lyndhurst Manor, Christopher extinguished the final candle and stood alone in darkness. He had chosen restraint. He had chosen dignity. He had chosen not to reveal what he had not been certain he possessed. Now he felt the cost of that restraint with uncomfortable clarity, and neither of them slept easily that night. The distance between manor and Dower house had never felt greater. Chapter 7. Rain in the Glasshouse. The storm gathered without warning. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted from pale summer blue to a heavy slate, clouds rolling low across the horizon like restrained unrest. The air thickened. Even the birds fell silent. Tilly was returning from the village with a small basket over her arm when the first distant rumble reached her. Storms no longer startled her, but they carried memory. A roof splintering, rain through broken beams, a duke arriving in lantern light. She turned toward the Dower house, intending to reach shelter before the rain broke fully. Halfway across the lawn, the wind sharpened. The first drops fell, large, sudden, decisive. She quickened her pace. Christopher had been near the east boundary when the sky darkened. He saw her crossing the grass just as the rain began in earnest. Miss Finch, he called. She turned, startled by both thunder and his voice. The downpour followed at once, swift and drenching. The Dower house was too far, the manor farther still. The glass house, he said, gesturing toward the iron-framed structure beyond the hedges. She nodded, and together they ran. Rain soaked through muslin within seconds. Her pale walking gown clung at the hem, her bonnet ribbon loosened and trailed behind her. His coat darkened, shoulders slick with rain. By the time they reached the Glasshouse doors, both were breathless. Christopher pulled the handle and ushered her inside. The door shut against the storm with a hollow metallic echo. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain struck the panes above them in steady percussion, blurring the grounds beyond into silver-grey obscurity. Inside, the air was warm and close, scented with damp earth, citrus leaves, and blooming jasmine. Tilly removed her bonnet slowly. Loose strands of golden hair had escaped entirely now, curling softly around her face and down her neck. Droplets clung to her lashes. "You have a talent," she said quietly, "for appearing during inclement weather." "I prefer better conditions," he replied. Her smile was small, but unmistakable. They stood several feet apart, close enough to feel the warmth of shared shelter, far enough to maintain propriety. Thunder rolled again, louder now. The glass house trembled faintly. For the first time in days, there was nowhere else to be. No ledger to review, no guests to intercept, no conversations half heard. Only rain. And each other. Tilly moved toward a wooden bench near a row of potted lemon trees. "My mother will worry," she said, though she made no move toward the door. "She distrusts thunder." "Wisely," he said. She glanced at him. "You speak from experience." He removed his gloves and set them beside a tray of seedlings. "My father valued order above most things," he said after a moment. "A household, an estate, even a conversation had its proper structure." She waited. "Storms," he added quietly, "did not respect structure." She studied him. "You resemble him?" "In title," he said. "Not in temperament." He stepped nearer the bench, though he did not yet sit. "My father believed authority required distance. Familiarity invited weakness." Rain drummed harder against the roof. "When I inherited," he continued, "I found some of his habits had become my own. Distance is efficient. It preserves order." "And does it preserve you?" she asked. He did not answer at once. "I have been Duke of Lyndhurst for 6 years," he said finally. "I am received with respect in every room I enter. I am consulted, deferred to, observed." He paused. "But rarely known." Tilly felt the words settle somewhere deeper than she liked. "You are known," she said quietly, "by those who choose to see." He looked at her then, fully. "And who chooses?" he asked. She held his gaze. "I do." Something in his expression shifted. Rain softened slightly, though thunder still rolled in distant waves. "You have altered Lyndhurst," he said, in ways I did not anticipate. She almost smiled. "You mean the fencing drills?" "And the laughter," he admitted. The silence that followed was warmer than the one before it. Tilly lowered herself onto the bench at last, clasping her hands loosely in her lap. The damp hem of her gown brushed the stone floor. Christopher removed his coat and draped it over the back of the bench, before sitting beside her in shirt sleeves, careful to leave space between them. "You spoke of distance," she said. "I have practiced something similar." He turned slightly, listening. "My father's passing was peaceful," she said, her voice even, "but peace does not prevent what follows." She drew a slow breath. "There were debts we had not anticipated, small ones, accumulated. His salary ended at once. I discovered very quickly that grief must wait for arithmetic." Christopher's jaw tightened. "My mother had the boys to comfort. The rest fell to me." She said it plainly, without self-pity. That made it harder to hear. "I did not wish my mother to see uncertainty," she went on, "nor the boys. Strength became a habit." The word echoed his own. "I learned to calculate before I allowed myself to feel," she said. "I learned to speak calmly, even when I was frightened." "And now?" he asked. She looked down at her clasped hands. "Now," she admitted softly, "I am tired." He did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was quiet. "You should not carry it alone." She gave a faint laugh. "Should I assign portions of it to the twins?" "I would advise against that." Despite herself, she smiled. For a moment they sat in companionable quiet, the rain settling into a steadier rhythm overhead. Then Christopher said, carefully, "You consider Mr. Harcourt's offer." She did not flinch. "Yes." "For security," he said. "For ease," she corrected gently. He absorbed that. "And if ease costs you joy?" She turned her head and looked at him slowly. "You speak as though joy were assured elsewhere." He did not answer immediately, because he did not yet know how. The storm had gentled to a steady hush against the glass. Christopher sat beside her, close enough now to see the faint rise and fall of her breath. The rain-darkened curl resting against the curve of her neck. The droplet tracing a slow path along her temple. He had the sudden, unsteady urge to brush it away. He did not. "You deserve more than ease," he said. She kept her gaze forward. "Deserving is beside the point," she said. "One does what necessity requires." He studied her profile, the calm line of her mouth, the strength beneath its softness. "You speak as though necessity had asked something singular of you," he said. She met his gaze. "Are we not all answerable to it?" "Not in the same way." She turned toward him then, and their shoulders nearly touched. "You are not alone," he said, more carefully now. "Not here." The words settled between them. She searched his face. Not for courtesy or restraint, but for something plainer. Truth. "And yet," she said softly, "when the matter is real, you retreat behind formality." He did not deny it. After a moment he said, "I heard you." She stilled. "On the south path, with Harcourt." Understanding moved slowly across her face. "You did not hear all." "I heard enough." "You heard security," she said. "You did not hear hesitation." Rain ticked softly against the panes. Somewhere beyond the glass, thunder rolled farther away. "You said you would consider," he said. "Yes, and that was not acceptance." "No," he let out a breath. Long and quiet. "I believed you had chosen prudence over—" He broke off. She waited. "At least say what you mean." His gaze lifted to hers. "Over uncertainty," he said. For a moment she only looked at him. "Do you truly believe I value certainty above all else?" "I believe you value responsibility." "Yes, and sacrifice." She gave the smallest nod. "And dignity." A faint, sad smile touched her mouth. "All true," she said, "but not at the expense of my own heart." The words unsettled him. He had thought of her circumstances, her family, the pressures arrayed around her. He had thought of his own caution, but not this plainly, not her heart. Before he could think better of it, he took her hand. Not by accident. Not in some gesture he might later pretend had meant less than it did. He reached for it deliberately, and when his fingers closed around hers, she drew in a quick breath, but did not pull away. Their joined hands rested between them, uncovered and unmistakable. "I do not wish you to choose him, only for security," he said. Her eyes held his. "And if I do not?" His pulse beat hard against his throat. Every habit of discipline rose at once to meet the moment. Title. Expectation. The old instruction never to speak before certainty. Never to reach where one could not at once promise. A duke must not gamble. A duke must not speak from feeling and call it honour afterward. He thought of his mother's letters, of advantageous matches, and measured futures. He thought of Harcourt, safe and sensible. Then he looked at Tilly, rain-damp hair curling at her temples, blue eyes steady despite the fatigue she never named. All that strength with its hidden capacity for joy, and the entire structure of his caution felt suddenly like cowardice in finer dress. "You would ask," she said, almost gently. His hand tightened around hers. "I would ask you not to go to him." Her expression changed at once. Not dramatically. That was what made it painful. The softness in her gaze remained, but disappointment moved beneath it, quiet and unmistakable. "I cannot remain indefinitely without direction," she said. He closed his eyes for half a beat, because there it was, the mercy she would not ask for, and the courage he had still not matched. Outside, the rain had thinned to a faint, irregular patter. He lifted her hand slightly, almost without realizing it, then let it fall again. If he spoke now, the world he had been arranging would alter. If he did not, he might lose her to one already arranged. Slowly, reluctantly, he released her. "We should return," he said. "Yes." They stepped apart. The loss of her warmth was immediate. He opened the glasshouse door, and cool air entered, washed clean by rain. Together they stepped out onto the path, the storm already withdrawing into the dark. Nothing between them was resolved. But neither was it hidden any longer. Whatever came next, it would not be decided by silence. Chapter 8. Where Silence Ends. The morning after the storm dawned with deceptive clarity. The lawns lay bright beneath fresh sunlight. The gravel paths were washed clean. The glasshouse windows gleamed as though nothing momentous had occurred within them. Tilly rose early. She had not slept. The memory of the glasshouse lingered. His hand warm around hers, his voice low with something dangerously close to confession. He had asked her to remain, not to choose him, not to marry him, only to remain. She had returned to the Dower house with her heart unsettled and her thoughts unguarded. By midnight, she had reached her conclusion. Security is not selfish, she reminded herself. Ease is not betrayal. Mr. Harcourt had called again that morning. He stood now beneath the small archway of climbing roses outside the Dower house, posture composed, expression hopeful but restrained. "I will not press you," he said gently. "I seek only honesty." Tilly folded her gloved hands before her. "You deserve that," she replied. Her mother watched quietly from the window within. The twins had been sent to the far end of the lawn with firm instructions to keep their distance. "I believe you would offer stability," Tilly continued. "I would," Harcourt answered. "And I believe my family would be secure." They would. She hesitated only once. And in that hesitation lay everything unsaid. "I accept," she said at last. Harcourt exhaled. Relief, satisfaction, perhaps even gratitude. "You will not regret it," he assured her. She hoped he was correct. He reached for her hand and kissed her gloved knuckles with proper restraint. Inside, Mrs. Finch closed her eyes briefly. The twins, peering from behind the hedge though they had been told to stay away, stared without a word. Samuel spoke first. "Well, that's bad." Oliver nodded. "Very bad." 3 days later, Christopher learned of the engagement from the steward, who had only just returned from Bath. Not from her. Not from Harcourt. From the steward. "I understand congratulations are in order, Your Grace," the man said carefully, ledger tucked beneath his arm. Christopher gave no outward sign of reaction. "Explain." "Miss Finch has accepted Mr. Harcourt's proposal. Word is already circulating." For a moment, Christopher said nothing. "I see," he said at last. The steward shifted awkwardly. "It is considered a sensible match." Sensible. Christopher dismissed him with a nod. When the door closed, he remained where he was, utterly still. Accepted. He had hesitated. He had measured. He had preserved dignity. And Harcourt had asked. He moved to the window. Across the lawn he saw Harcourt departing, with the quiet confidence of a man who expected to return. He saw Tilly standing beside her mother. She did not look triumphant. She looked composed. Too composed. Something in him tightened with sudden force. He had believed love, if that was what this growing, relentless pull toward her had become, to be indulgent. Now he understood something far more inconvenient. Loss was worse. Preparations began almost at once. Not elaborate ones. Mr. Harcourt's estate was modest, his household small, but sufficient to alter the rhythm of Lyndhurst in ways that could not be ignored. A seamstress was summoned to adjust gowns. Letters were drafted. Mrs. Finch began making lists in her neat, decided hand. Aunt Eugenia offered unsolicited commentary regarding French bridal customs, most of which bore questionable resemblance to reality. The twins, however, regarded the development as a disaster. "She'll go away," Samuel said darkly, pacing the edge of the lawn. "To another house," Oliver agreed. "We shan't know anything, or get any decent fencing lessons." Tilly overheard and forced a smile. "I am not departing tomorrow," she said gently. "You may survive my absence." But the words tasted unfamiliar. At the manor, Christopher maintained impeccable composure. He congratulated Harcourt when the gentleman called formally to announce the engagement. He expressed polite satisfaction that Miss Finch's future was secured. Harcourt, quietly triumphant, spoke warmly of modest renovations to his estate, of plans for improved tenant cottages, and of the small morning room he hoped his wife might make her own. Christopher listened, nodded, endured. Afterward, he retreated to the strip of grass behind the hedge where he had taken to teaching the twins. He practiced alone. The blade cut clean arcs through the air, precise and controlled. His footwork was flawless, his breathing measured. He imagined Harcourt where he himself had not dared to stand. He imagined Tilly walking beside another man across another estate. He misjudged a step. The blade struck the wooden post beside him with sharp force. He lowered it immediately. "This is weakness," he told himself. "Attachment clouds judgment." His father's voice echoed faintly in memory. "Distance preserves authority." He had preserved distance, and now he felt its cost. That afternoon, the twins appeared in the manor corridor, as though on official business. The butler, too startled to stop them, let them pass. Christopher looked up from his desk as they entered side by side, wearing identical expressions of grave importance. "Your Grace," Samuel said. "We have news," Oliver added. Christopher set down his pen. "That sounds ominous." Samuel drew himself up. "Tilly is unhappy." Oliver nodded. "About Mr. Harcourt?" Christopher's expression altered very little. "In what way?" Samuel answered at once. "She cried." "In the evening," Oliver said. Christopher went still. "She thought we were asleep," Samuel added. "We were not," said Oliver. "There was a great deal of muffled sniffling," Samuel said, "and one handkerchief," Oliver said, "possibly two." The room fell quiet. Christopher looked from one boy to the other. "You are certain?" The twins exchanged a solemn glance. "Yes," they said together. Christopher thanked them and sent them away. When the door closed, he remained where he was, unmoving. She had cried. Not from relief, not from peace. From having accepted what she could bear, not what she wanted. He rose so abruptly that the chair behind him shifted against the carpet. He had mistaken composure for indifference. He had mistaken prudence for willingness. He had mistaken her strength for immunity to pain. And worst of all, he had mistaken restraint for honour. It was not honour. It was fear. He crossed the room in decisive strides. For the first time since inheriting Lyndhurst, Christopher Vale did not calculate consequence before action. He thought only of truth, and the truth was intolerable. He would not lose her without speaking. Christopher did not go to her at once. Impulse had never ruled him, and he would not let it now. Not in a matter that would alter both their lives. Instead, he walked across the east lawn toward the glass house, where rain had once driven them into shelter, and he had still failed to speak plainly. The memory of her hand in his rose unbidden. Warm, deliberate, unafraid, she had not drawn away. She had not said yes without pain. She had cried. The realization settled with quiet force. He had believed himself honourable in restraint. In truth, he had been afraid. Afraid to offer what might be refused. Afraid to risk affection where certainty could not be guaranteed. Afraid to stand where his father had never stood, openly vulnerable. He paused outside the glasshouse door. Inside, late sunlight shimmered through the panes. Leaves cast shifting shadows across the stone floor. "My father mistook distance for strength," he said aloud to the empty air. The words felt different now. Distance had preserved nothing. It had nearly cost him everything. Footsteps sounded behind him. He turned. Mrs. Finch approached slowly along the path, hands folded, expression calm but searching. "Your Grace," she said. "Mrs. Finch." She stopped a few feet away. "My daughter believes she has acted wisely," she said gently. He did not interrupt. "She also believes the burden of this choice is hers alone." That struck. "She does not understand," Mrs. Finch continued, "that some decisions require more than prudence. They require courage." Christopher met her gaze steadily. "I have not offered her sufficient clarity," he said. Mrs. Finch studied him, not as a duke, but as a man. "No," she agreed softly. "You have not." Silence lingered between them, but it was not hostile, only honest. "She will depart within a fortnight," Mrs. Finch added. "Mr. Harcourt is efficient." A fortnight. The word tightened his resolve. "I thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me the truth." Mrs. Finch inclined her head. "I have always preferred it." She left him there, beneath the arching iron frame of the glass house, sunlight fading slowly toward evening. Christopher stood still a moment longer. Then he turned back toward the manor. Not to reconsider, not to retreat, but to wait for the hour when he could speak plainly. He did not rehearse words. He offered no arguments. He carried only certainty. Across the lawn, the twins spotted him first. Samuel straightened. "He approaches." Oliver narrowed his eyes. "He looks determined." Christopher passed them without slowing. At the door he paused only long enough to steady his breath. He did not knock lightly. He knocked once, firm, decisive. Inside, Tilly rose from the small table where invitation drafts lay neatly stacked. Something in the knock sent her heart into sudden motion, though she told herself it could be anyone. She opened the door. He stood there, coat unbuttoned, hair unsettled by wind, composure altered but not abandoned. "Miss Finch," he said, not distant, not formal. Her pulse thundered. "Yes, I believe," he said, his voice steady though urgency lay beneath it. "We must speak." Behind her, Aunt Eugenia rose from her chair with elaborate suddenness. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "I find I have developed an immediate need to be elsewhere." She collected her shawl, gave Christopher one long, assessing look, and added, "Do try not to waste her time." Then she swept from the room before Tilly could say a word. The hearth crackled softly behind them. Before her stood a man who had finally chosen to speak plainly. Chapter 9. Lady Lyndhurst calls. Lady Lyndhurst arrived just before 4 o'clock, in a carriage so darkly polished and impeccably appointed that even the gravel seemed to receive it with apprehension. Instead of stopping before the manor, however, the carriage turned toward the Dower house. The twins saw it first. Samuel, perched on the window seat and looking out, stiffened. "There is a carriage," he said. Oliver joined him at once. A forbidding one. They watched as the footman descended. The door was opened, and a lady emerged in dove-grey silk, with a travelling mantle, so perfectly arranged that the journey itself appeared to have apologised. "She looks expensive," Samuel said. "And severe," Oliver added. "Very severe." At that moment, Aunt Eugenia entered the room with a work-basket over one arm, and found both boys flattened against the window. "What are you doing?" "Observing danger," Samuel replied. Aunt Eugenia came to the glass, took one look at the visitor stepping from the carriage, and inhaled with unmistakable interest. "Oh," she said. "At last." Mrs. Finch lowered her book. Tilly, who had been bent over a piece of mending she had already unpicked twice, set it aside with rather more force than was necessary. "Who is it?" Aunt Eugenia's smile widened. "My dear, unless I am much mistaken, it is the Dowager Duchess of Lyndhurst, and she has not come to admire the shrubbery." The room altered at once. The tea-tray remained where it was. The curtains lifted and fell in the mild afternoon air, and yet the atmosphere changed completely, as though the house itself had drawn breath. Mrs. Finch rose first. "Tilly, I know. Do you?" Tilly got to her feet. No, but I shall try to be convincing. That is often enough, said Aunt Eugenia. A maid appeared a moment later, wearing the solemn expression peculiar to those required to announce rank under inconvenient circumstances. Lady Lyndhurst. She entered without haste and without wasted motion, carrying with her that particular composure which had less to do with calm than with lifelong certainty of being obeyed. She was handsome rather than pretty, though time had refined rather than diminished the effect. Her eyes rested first on Mrs. Finch, then Tilly, then Aunt Eugenia, whose expression brightened as though at the opening of a promising play. Mrs. Finch. Miss Finch. Her gaze moved once about the room, taking in the tea service, the evident domesticity of the scene, and the unmistakable fact that the Dower house had become altogether more inhabited than she preferred. I had not been aware, she added, that the Dower house had grown so lively. Aunt Eugenia smiled with dangerous sweetness. It is astonishing how quickly a house improves when it is inhabited. Mrs. Finch intervened at once. Lady Lyndhurst, you are welcome. Pray be seated. Thank you. The twins, who had not been invited to remain but had also not been explicitly banished, hovered near the door with the expression of boys who sensed history and hoped not to be excluded from it. Lady Lyndhurst sat. Aunt Eugenia, with remarkable speed for a woman who had complained of her knee only that morning, occupied the chair nearest her. Tilly remained standing for one perilous instant before remembering herself and sitting beside her mother. I understand congratulations are in order, Lady Lyndhurst said, turning to Tilly with a civility so polished it might have been silver. Mr. Harcourt is thought highly suitable. He is very well regarded, Mrs. Finch said. Yes, said Aunt Eugenia. He has all the qualities one hopes for in a dependable husband or a conscientious bishop. Tilly closed her eyes briefly. Lady Lyndhurst's gaze shifted. And you are? Miss Eugenia Finch, said Aunt Eugenia. An unfortunate relation, though not, I hope, an uninteresting one. A pause followed. Lady Lyndhurst inclined her head by the smallest discernible degree. Indeed. Tea was poured. The twins exchanged a glance and withdrew behind the half-open door, where their shadows remained quite visible upon the carpet. Aunt Eugenia accepted her tea, took one sip, and appeared to find it unequal to the moment. From her reticule she produced a small silver flask. Lady Lyndhurst watched, quite still, as Aunt Eugenia added a measured amount to her cup. Mrs. Finch closed her eyes briefly. Tincture of fortitude, Aunt Eugenia said, stirring once. Lady Lyndhurst's voice was cool. Is that your usual practice? Only when surprised by rank before dinner. The twins, still half hidden beyond the door, exchanged a look of pure delight, and Mrs. Finch rose with quiet firmness and crossed to the door. You may wait in the garden. But this is important, Samuel whispered. So is obedience, said Mrs. Finch. They departed, reluctantly. Lady Lyndhurst accepted her cup and saucer from Tilly. You have been much spoken of lately, Miss Finch. I had not known I was of such consequence. One rarely is, Lady Lyndhurst said, until one becomes inconvenient. Tilly has never been inconvenient, said Mrs. Finch quietly. No? Lady Lyndhurst stirred her tea once. Then perhaps the situation has been. Aunt Eugenia reached for a biscuit. Only to those who prefer neat arrangements to human ones, she said. Lady Lyndhurst did not smile. How fortunate that I prefer both. No one spoke for a moment. Lady Lyndhurst set down her cup. I confess I was relieved to hear that Mr. Harcourt has acted with decisiveness. It is generally best when uncertainty is brought to a proper conclusion. At that, Tilly's fingers tightened slightly upon her saucer. Aunt Eugenia observed the movement at once. Yes, she said. One cannot allow people to go on indefinitely with hope. It grows untidy. Eugenia, Mrs. Finch said. What? We are all being frank. It seems a pity to begin rationing it now. The door opened. Christopher entered a few moments later, having been told only that his mother was at the Dower house. The scene before him, the assembled ladies, the tea tray on the small round table, his mother seated like an occupying force in the best chair, told him at once that whatever conversation he had interrupted had not been mild. He bowed. Mother, Christopher. Nothing in Lady Lyndhurst's expression altered, but something in the room did. She had expected him, perhaps. She had not expected him quite so soon. Christopher acknowledged Mrs. Finch and Tilly, then inclined his head to Aunt Eugenia, who looked back at him with the expression of a woman whose expectations had been low and were now, unexpectedly, being met. "I had not understood you were expected," he said to his mother. "I should hope not," she replied. "It would diminish the effect." Aunt Eugenia made a small choking sound into her teacup, which might, by generosity, have been taken for a cough. Christopher remained standing. "I trust your journey was not too fatiguing." "Fatigue was not my concern." "No," he said. "I did not imagine it was." Lady Lyndhurst noticed the twins peeking in through the window. "The estate appears to have grown unusually informal in my absence." Christopher's gaze flicked, very briefly, to Tilly. "It has improved in several respects." Aunt Eugenia looked into her tea to conceal a smile. Lady Lyndhurst folded her hands. "I have come because this matter has already gone further than it ought without clarity." "On that point," said Aunt Eugenia, "we are in perfect agreement." "Miss Finch," said Lady Lyndhurst, without looking at her, "I do not recall addressing you." "No," said Aunt Eugenia cheerfully, "but you did stray into one of my opinions, and I am always obliged to retrieve it." Tilly very nearly laughed and had to disguise it by reaching for her cup. Christopher set his gloves on the mantel. "My mother has travelled some distance," Christopher said evenly. "I imagine she would prefer that we speak plainly." At that, Lady Lyndhurst looked at him directly. "Yes," she said, "I would." She turned her gaze to Tilly again. "I have no wish to make you uncomfortable, Miss Finch, but this arrangement has attracted more notice than is desirable. Your engagement to Mr. Harcourt, I think, will put a proper end to it." Tilly set down her cup with care. "If my presence here has occasioned difficulty," she said, "I regret it." "No," Christopher said. The word fell cleanly into the room. Lady Lyndhurst looked at him. "No?" "No," he repeated. "Miss Finch's presence here has occasioned no difficulty that ought to concern her. She has been of use to the estate, of value to this house, and of more consequence to Lyndhurst than many people with a better claim to permanence." Lady Lyndhurst's eyes sharpened. "You speak with unusual warmth." "For once," said Aunt Eugenia, "we must all be grateful for novelty." Christopher did not look away from his mother. "I speak as I ought to have spoken sooner." Lady Lyndhurst set down her cup. "Mr. Harcourt has been accepted." "Yes," Christopher said, "because I left her to believe herself unchosen." A stillness followed. "And what do you intend to do now?" Lady Lyndhurst asked. Christopher turned then, not to his mother, but to Tilly. "What I should have done before," he said. Tilly rose slowly. He crossed to her and stopped before her. "This should have been said already," he said. "It was not. That failure is mine." Her heart was beating far too hard. "Christopher," he took her hand. "Miss Finch is no longer engaged to Mr. Harcourt," he said, and now he turned just enough that the room could hear him plainly. "She is to marry me." No one moved. Not Mrs. Finch. Not Aunt Eugenia. Not even Lady Lyndhurst. Tilly looked at him, half appalled, half on the brink of laughter. "That is a very abrupt form of announcement." "I am trying to improve." "At speed, evidently." "Yes." He did not release her hand. "If you object to the manner of it," he said quietly, for her alone now, "I can only plead urgency." "I can see that." Aunt Eugenia pressed a hand to her heart. At last. Tilly looked up at him. "My family?" she asked softly. "They remain precisely where they are, for as long as they wish," he said at once, with security and with complete independence. She searched his face, only a moment longer. Then she said, "In that case, I believe Lady Lyndhurst has been misinformed." Aunt Eugenia made a sound of triumph. Christopher's mouth curved. Lady Lyndhurst regarded them both in silence. At length she said, "It seems I have." Before anyone could say more, the twins came hurtling in from the garden. "Did she say yes?" Samuel demanded. Oliver took one look at their joined hands and grinned. "She did." Their cheer rang through the room. Tilly laughed outright. Mrs. Finch closed her eyes for a moment. Christopher's mouth gave way, briefly, to something very like happiness. "Aunt Eugenia," apparently judging the moment to require reinforcement, drew out her silver flask and added a little more to her tea. Lady Lyndhurst looked at the cup. Aunt Eugenia stirred once. "Are you quite sure you would not like a splash? It has been a taxing visit." Lady Lyndhurst's gaze moved to Tilly. "My son has many virtues," she said. "He has never been quick where his feelings are concerned." Tilly, still holding Christopher's hand, answered before she could stop herself. "No," she said, "he has not." To Tilly's astonishment, the faintest trace of unwilling amusement touched Lady Lyndhurst's mouth. "Very well," she said. Aunt Eugenia sat back with satisfaction. "Excellent. We are all to survive." "Eugenia," said Mrs. Finch. "What?" It was in doubt. Christopher bent his head slightly toward Tilly. "Are you quite well?" he murmured. "No," she whispered back. "I am in complete disorder." "Good," he said. "So am I." Chapter 10. A wedding at Lyndhurst. Lyndhurst had not hosted a wedding in over 20 years. The estate responded accordingly. Garlands of late summer roses framed the chapel doors. White ribbons stirred gently at the pew ends. Even the butler, usually immovable in all matters except service, appeared faintly invested in floral symmetry. The twins had been assigned the critical office of door guardians, a role they interpreted as military command. "We secure the entrance," Samuel announced solemnly. "Against what?" Oliver asked. "Trouble." Oliver nodded. "There is always trouble." Inside the Dower house, Tilly stood before the long mirror in her mother's chamber. Her gown rested lightly upon her. Ivory silk catching the morning light with a soft, luminous glow. Christopher had insisted the dress be made for her, as though he could not bear that even this one moment meant entirely for joy should come from her own careful labour. He had tried to insist on more besides, an entirely new wardrobe ordered at once. She had protested. He had listened with grave attention, agreed with every sensible objection, and calmly done as he pleased. This gown was the first of it. It was beautiful without ostentation. The silk was fine and fluid, the empire bodice shaped with quiet precision, the modest neckline softened by the faintest embroidery. From the narrow band beneath the bust, the skirt fell in long, graceful folds, moving like pale water when she walked. The hem was finished with a border of small hand-stitched blossoms. That part was hers. Each flower was slightly different, a petal turned here, a leaf curved there, a thread drawn just a shade deeper or lighter than the last. No two were alike. She had sewn them in quiet evenings, one after another, until the silk seemed to carry a garden of its own. Each one deliberate. Each one a promise. Her golden hair had been arranged in smooth coils, with softer curls left at her temples. At her ears hung the small pearl drops her father had once given her. Mrs. Finch stood behind her, hands steady despite the brightness in her eyes. "You look," her mother began, then paused. "Happy." Tilly met her gaze in the mirror and smiled. "I am." Aunt Eugenia, seated near the window with the air of a woman supervising state affairs, stirred her fan. "In France," she observed, "dukes wept openly." Mrs. Finch glanced at her. "We are not in France." "A persistent disappointment," said Aunt Eugenia. The twins burst in without knocking. "We have inspected the chapel," Samuel declared. "There are no obvious hazards," Oliver added. "Except nerves," said Samuel. "And a vicar," said Oliver. Aunt Eugenia nodded. "Both grave risks." Tilly laughed. Christopher Vale stood at the front of the estate chapel and discovered, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that posture could not solve everything. He wore a formal black coat cut with perfect severity, an ivory waistcoat beneath, and a cravat tied with immaculate precision. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass above the altar, laying muted colour over the stone floor and across his polished shoes. He had faced Parliament. He had faced his mother. He had faced storms. He had not faced this. When the chapel doors opened, conversation hushed at once. Samuel and Oliver entered first, solemn, determined, and only slightly too pleased with their own importance. Christopher's mouth twitched. Then Tilly appeared. For a moment, the rest of the chapel ceased to exist. She stepped into the aisle in ivory silk and morning light, her hair gleaming softly beneath the chapel's glow. She did not hurry. She did not falter. She only came toward him with that same calm steadiness that had undone him from the first. Christopher felt the tightness in his chest change into something quieter. Gratitude. By the time she reached him, whatever neutrality he had meant to preserve was gone entirely. His expression was tender, open, unmistakable, and everyone saw it. Lady Lyndhurst, seated in the front pew, remained perfectly still. Only when Tilly reached the altar did she incline her head, the gesture slight but unmistakable. Aunt Eugenia leaned toward Mrs. Finch. In France, she whispered, he would already be in tears. Mrs. Finch pressed her lips together. The vicar cleared his throat with ceremonial gravity. Dearly beloved. Samuel elbowed Oliver discreetly. Oliver whispered, "This is the long bit." Christopher heard it. He did not look away from Tilly. She stood opposite him, hands steady, blue eyes bright in the filtered chapel light. Up close, he could see the delicate embroidery at the hem of her gown. "You made them yourself," he murmured. "Yes," she replied. "I dislike leaving things unfinished." He smiled then openly, without any effort at concealment. The vicar continued through the familiar service, and the old words of duty and fidelity, spoken so often for so many, seemed to gather a different kind of weight around them. When Christopher answered, his voice was steady. "I will." When Tilly answered, hers was steady too. "I will." Only when he took her hand for the ring did he bend his head slightly and say, too low for anyone else to hear, "No more distance." Her breath caught. She did not look away. "No," she whispered, "no more." The ring was then requested, or rather, meant to be produced. Samuel stepped forward with confidence, then stopped. Oliver stared at the small velvet cushion in horror. "There is no ring," he whispered. A faint ripple of alarm moved through the chapel. Samuel checked one pocket, then looked stricken. Aunt Eugenia closed her eyes. "In France," she murmured, "someone would already have been challenged." Christopher did not release Tilly's hand. "Left pocket," he said calmly. Samuel obeyed. The ring emerged at once. "It moved," Samuel said. "On purpose," Oliver added. The chapel breathed again, this time with laughter. The vicar, who had seen worse and intended never to admit it, resumed the ceremony. Christopher slid the ring onto Tilly's finger slowly, as though the act itself deserved every degree of care. She did the same for him, her fingers steady despite the warmth rising in her throat. The gold bands caught the morning light. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Christopher drew her gently closer. The kiss he gave her was not theatrical. It was not hurried. It was warm, certain, and so plainly felt that the chapel seemed to soften around it. When they parted, her hand came to rest briefly against his chest, and he covered it with his own. Behind them, Aunt Eugenia dabbed at her eyes. "In France," she declared, "we would all be weeping by now." Samuel leaned toward Oliver. "I did not weep." Oliver nodded gravely. "Nor I. We remain firm." Christopher turned slightly toward the pews. "You may applaud," he said dryly, and they did. The wedding breakfast was held on the south lawn beneath a long white canopy trimmed with greenery from Lyndhurst's own gardens. Tables dressed in crisp linen stood bright beneath the late morning sun. Roses and ivy ran the length of the central table, with crystal and silver catching the light in flashes. Christopher had insisted that the meal be generous. There was roasted lamb, fragrant with rosemary, warm bread rolls wrapped in linen to keep their heat, bowls of sugared fruit glistening like small jewels, and delicate pastries filled with herbs and pigeon. A towering cake stood at the centre of the table, its layers spread with lemon cream and bright berries that stained the icing with cheerful colour. Plates passed easily from hand to hand, the air warm with the scent of fresh bread and citrus. Champagne moved among the guests with quiet efficiency, glasses appearing and filling almost as soon as they were emptied. Aunt Eugenia paused beside Lady Lyndhurst's chair, with a champagne glass in one hand. "No flask today?" Lady Lyndhurst asked. Aunt Eugenia blinked. "My dear Lady Lyndhurst, this is a wedding. I came prepared. Christopher sat beside Tilly at the head of the table. Her ivory silk shone against the green lawn beyond. Every so often he looked at her with the expression of a man still confirming his own good fortune. She caught him doing so. You may look openly, she murmured. I am. Across the table, Aunt Eugenia had placed herself where she might best watch the proceedings. This champagne, she declared after one sip, has made a creditable attempt. The twins, meanwhile, had been entrusted with lemonade, after noticing with great interest that the guests' champagne glasses contained bubbles. They regarded the lemonade with fresh suspicion. It looks weak, Samuel said. Oliver scanned the table. Opportunity presented itself in the form of an unattended champagne flute. It shimmered invitingly. Samuel glanced left. Oliver glanced right. The flute vanished. A moment later, Samuel coughed. Oliver blinked hard. Samuel coughed again, trying very much not to. Christopher's gaze shifted. Are you unwell? Mrs. Finch asked. Samuel shook his head at once. Oliver leaned toward him and whispered, much too audibly, It bites. Christopher set down his fork. Samuel, yes, Your Grace. What have you taken? Samuel swallowed. The wrong glass. By mistake, Oliver added. Mostly. Aunt Eugenia took a measured sip of champagne. In France, she murmured, that would be considered educational. Tilly pressed her lips together against laughter. Christopher rose. Gentlemen, he said evenly. You appear to have made an error of judgment. Samuel's eyes were watering. Yes, Your Grace. Christopher removed the offending flute and set the lemonade back in front of them. You will drink what was given to you, he said. Yes, Your Grace, they said in unison. Christopher resumed his seat. Tilly was laughing too hard to trust herself with speech. You are enjoying this, he observed. Immensely. They will survive. I have every confidence. He looked at her for a moment, at the sunlight caught in her hair, the laughter in her eyes, and the ease that had at last replaced so much effort and restraint. You are happy, he said quietly. She turned toward him. Yes. There was no hesitation in it now. No second thought. No shadow of duty trying to disguise itself as choice. Around them, laughter rose and glasses met lightly. The twins recovered enough to debate the treachery of bubbles. Aunt Eugenia instructed a footman on the proper treatment of French champagne, most of which the footman bore with remarkable serenity. Lyndhurst felt altered. Not grander, not richer, only warmer. Christopher reached beneath the table and took Tilly's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. This, he said softly, is better than distance. She smiled. Yes, she said, it is. And beneath the white canopy, with laughter moving easily through the summer air, Lyndhurst no longer felt merely well-ordered. It felt happy. Epilogue. 5 years later. Lyndhurst in summer. Lyndhurst no longer felt newly restored. It felt lived in. The southern fields rippled gold beneath the late afternoon sun, wheat thick and healthy, where once the fields had promised more than they gave. Tenant cottages stood freshly whitewashed, roofs repaired before winter ever threatened them. Children ran where mud had once gathered. Reform, carefully managed, had become rhythm. At the heart of it stood the manor, not colder for its grandeur, but warmer for its welcome. From the open windows drifted laughter. Christopher Vale, Duke of Lyndhurst, stood on the terrace with a child balanced securely against his hip. The boy, all golden curls and solemn blue eyes, clutched his father's lapel with fierce determination. Down, the child commanded. You have only just arrived, Christopher replied calmly. Down. Christopher glanced toward the lawn. The twins are already teaching you bad habits, he said. Across the grass, Samuel and Oliver, now 15, taller and no wiser, were engaged in what appeared to be a fencing lesson of highly questionable discipline. Samuel held a wooden practice sword, with unnecessary flourish, while Oliver corrected his stance with the gravity of a man instructing raw recruits. Your elbow is wandering, Oliver said. It is advancing, Samuel replied. Christopher sighed. Down, the boy insisted again. You are relentless. Yes, that is unfortunate. but he lowered him carefully to the grass. The boy ran at once toward the twins, who received him with all the seriousness due to a very junior recruit. From the terrace doorway, Tilly watched. 5 years had only made her more entirely herself. She wore soft rose silk that caught the late sunlight with a gentle warmth. The gown shaped simply but beautifully, with delicate embroidery at the neckline, cuffs and sleeves. Her golden hair was pinned up in an elegant twist, with softer strands left to frame her face. In one hand she carried a ledger, with the other she steadied one of their twin boys, who had been leaning with dangerous enthusiasm toward the terrace steps. "Gently," she said. He looked up at her with blue-eyed seriousness and nodded, which meant nothing at all. "Yes," she said at last, releasing him. "You may go." He flew down the steps at once to join his brother on the lawn. She approached her husband with measured calm. "Samuel has taught them improper lunging," she observed. Christopher did not look away from the chaos unfolding below. "He calls it innovation." She handed him a strawberry. "And the north cottages?" she asked. "Completed ahead of schedule." She nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Tenant yields?" "Improved." "Winter reserves?" "Prepared." She studied him. "You enjoy saying that." "I do." She smiled. They stood side by side, watching their children tumble across the lawn. "You feared this," she said softly. He glanced at her. "Love," she clarified. "Yes," he admitted. "And now?" He watched his son attempt a dramatic fencing stance far too large for his small arms. He watched the older twins argue strategy as though defending a kingdom. Then he looked at her. "It did not weaken me," he said quietly. "It strengthened everything." She slipped her hand into his with the same quiet certainty as the first time. Behind them, Aunt Eugenia emerged onto the terrace with a glass of champagne held critically aloft. "In France," she declared, surveying the children. "They would already be dueling properly." "They are 5, Tilly replied. "Exactly." Mrs. Finch followed more gently, contentment softening every line of her face. Christopher drew Tilly slightly closer. "Do you regret choosing uncertainty?" he asked softly. She rested her head briefly against his shoulder. "There was uncertainty," she said. Courage was simply what answered. The children's laughter carried upward, bright and fearless. 5 years ago, a storm had broken a roof and unsettled a duke. Now summer light lay steady across Lyndhurst, and no one within its walls stood alone. And so, Lyndhurst is full of comfort, laughter, and new beginnings. If you enjoyed this tender Regency romance, another awaits. A season of thorns and blossoms is waiting for you now. A spirited heroine, a proper gentleman, and a slow-burning love that must blossom through thorns. Tap the video on your screen to continue listening. I shall return soon with another romance, unless I've been spirited away by moonlight and mischief.